For over 1,000 years, one city stood as the shield of Europe and the last surviving heartbeat of the Roman Empire. From its golden rise to the apocalyptic siege of 1453, this is the epic story of how Constantinople became the center of the world, and how it ultimately fell. Back in 1852, a French translator and author named Théophile Gautier embarked on a journey to the city then known as Istanbul, which served as the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Thanks to the cutting-edge technology of steamships that were crisscrossing the Mediterranean at the time, he was able to complete the trip from Paris in less than 11 days. Gautier remained in the city for almost 3 months, and during his stay, he compiled a book filled with his detailed observations. Since he had aspired to be a painter in his youth and had spent years working as an art critic, his depictions of Istanbul are steeped in artistic language, as if he were evaluating a canvas rather than a city. He described the harbor as being packed with vessels from every nation, with small boats gliding across the water in all directions. Above all, he marveled at the incredible panorama of Constantinople revealing itself on the opposite shore. He noted that the view was so strangely beautiful that it was difficult to believe it was real. It looked less like reality and more like a theatrical set designed for an Eastern fairy tale, illuminated by a painter's imagination and the celestial glow of gaslights. For weeks, Gautier roamed the streets of Istanbul, exploring everything from its marketplaces to its graveyards. He wandered through tight alleyways and decaying cobbled avenues, constantly documenting what he saw. Wherever he went, he became more and more conscious of the ancient metropolis's vanished history. Although the local Ottoman Turks were increasingly calling their home Istanbul, Gautier and most of Europe recognized it by a much older title, Constantinople. This city had been the heart of a completely different empire, one that had stood as the dominant power in Europe for centuries. This power was the Byzantine Empire, or simply Byzantium. It began as the eastern section of the Roman Empire. When the West collapsed, the East survived. It endured for another 1,000 years after the date usually associated with the fall of Rome, standing strong and safeguarding the wisdom of the ancients within its magnificent libraries. However, the ruins of that glorious city were now scattered across the streets of modern Istanbul. Out of all the ruins Gautier visited, nothing moved him as deeply as the sight of the legendary Great Walls of Constantinople. He wrote that they would have traveled the entire length of Byzantium's ancient outer walls if they hadn't been so exhausted. He remarked that he couldn't imagine a ride anywhere in the world more austerely sorrowful than that path, stretching nearly a league between a cemetery and a mass of rubble. The ramparts consisted of 2 lines of walls bordered by square towers, with a wide moat at the base that is now used for farming. A stone parapet encircled this moat, creating what was effectively a triple line of fortification. These were the walls of Constantine, or at least what remained of them after time, earthquakes, and sieges had done their worst. Gautier wrote with emotion about the thick vegetation taking over the ancient stonework, with fig trees sprouting from the towers, with vines and grasses bursting out of cracks in the masonry. In one spot, a giant crevice had severed a tower from top to bottom. Further along, a massive wall had collapsed into the moat, but where the stone was missing, the elements had supplied earth and seeds. A shrub had taken the place of a missing battlement and grown into a tree. Thousands of tendrils from parasitic plants were actually sustaining stones that would have otherwise fallen. The roots of trees became like chains to bind them. The line of walls rose to the sky, its battered profile draped in ivy and gilded by time. The whole haunting scene felt like something out of a dream or a magical tale. As the weight of the city's history seemed to press down on him, it was hard to believe. It was difficult to conceive that an active, breathing metropolis still existed behind those obsolete fortifications, hiding Constantinople from view. It was far simpler to imagine oneself standing amidst the stone-cursed inhabitants of a mythical Arabian city. As Gautier strolled beneath the gentle sun of Istanbul along the perimeter of the walls, he surely questioned the scene before him. How was it possible for the formidable defenses of such a stronghold to crumble? How could a place that once stood as the very axis of the globe be reduced to scattered debris and wreckage? He must have wondered what on earth had become of Byzantium's grand heritage. This narrative explores one of the most incredible survival tales in human history, the thousand-year saga of the Byzantine Empire. It is a story of how a civilization endured the collapse of its western territories to carry Rome's legacy unbroken through the Middle Ages. It served as a bridge spanning two eras and two continents, only to eventually be crushed between them both. Ultimately, this is the chronicle of how Constantinople's supposedly unbreakable walls were finally leveled to the ground. However, 6 million years in the past, the Mediterranean Sea bore no resemblance to the cool, dark depths we see now. Back then, our primate ancestors hadn't even started walking upright. If you could travel to that era and stand on the coasts of North Africa, Turkey, Italy, or Greece, a nightmarish, lifeless vista would greet you. The ground plummeted 1,500 meters down into a vast, desolate expanse of salt flats. This bleak desert was dotted with lakes so saline that swimmers would float effortlessly on the surface. For over 600,000 years, shifting tectonic plates had severed this deep basin from the Atlantic Ocean. Over millennia, the trapped seawater evaporated, leaving behind a barren, salty wasteland where life was impossible. Yet, a cataclysmic transformation was on the horizon. A slender land bridge, merely 60 kilometers across, kept this massive, empty basin apart from the Atlantic, connecting what we now call Morocco and Spain. On the other side, the crushing mass of the global ocean pushed and surged against it. Over 600,000 years, the Atlantic surf eroded that thin, rocky barrier. The water chipped away at the cliffs until the land strip narrowed to 30 kilometers, then 15, then 5. Finally, roughly 5.3 million years ago, the stone dam shattered, unleashing the Atlantic into Europe. The ensuing event was likely one of the most terrifying and spectacular phenomena Earth has ever witnessed. The ocean roared into the Mediterranean basin, cascading down kilometer-high waterfalls in a furious deluge. Experts estimate this channel poured over 200 billion liters of seawater every second, a volume equal to 1,000 Amazon rivers, rushing at speeds reaching 90 miles per hour. The water level within the Mediterranean surged by up to 10 meters daily, creating a sea stretching 4,000 kilometers end-to-end. That is enough water to submerge all of North America from North Virginia to California. While this filling process might have taken up to 3 years, some scientists argue it finished in just a few months. The sheer power of the rushing water generated landslides and earthquakes visible in geological records today, spawning megatsunamis over 100 meters tall, high enough to engulf a 30-story skyscraper. We call this catastrophe the Zanclean flood, and it was through this violence that the tranquil sea we know today was born. This newly formed body of water was unique, a massive inland sea linked to the open ocean by the Straits of Gibraltar, a tiny channel just 8 kilometers wide. The flood turned Africa and Europe into distinct landmasses, a change that would profoundly influence the region's history and geography. Discoveries of skull fragments in Greece's Epidoma cave indicate that modern humans reached the Mediterranean roughly 200,000 years ago, migrating up the eastern coast from Africa. First, Neanderthals, an archaic human species perfectly suited for Europe's frigid environment, outperformed these early pioneers. However, over the following 100,000 years, waves of modern humans continued to exit Africa. They slowly drove the Neanderthals to the edges of Europe and eventually into total extinction. As the final ice age concluded, Europe's climate heated up, melting the northern glaciers and allowing humanity to populate the shores of this immense inland sea. Throughout the Bronze Age, various societies emerged and collapsed in this region. However, starting around 530 BC, a specific city on the coast began expanding its reach and magnitude. It was situated on a mild peninsula extending into the water, which its inhabitants called Mare Magnum, or the Great Sea. That city was Rome, and it was destined to forge an empire that would endure in some capacity for over 2 millennia. Rome's success stemmed from its mastery of military conquest, mass production, and organization. By 220 BC, Roman armies, clad in iron chainmail or scales and wielding iron weaponry, had seized the entire Italian peninsula along with the islands of Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily. By 140 BC, they had spilled over into the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain, and crossed the water to subdue the historic Greek cities. The Romans devised a method of territorial expansion that was financially self-sustaining. Conquered populations provided the economic foundation for further conquests. For instance, after seizing the Macedonian treasury in 167 BC, Rome was able to effectively eliminate taxes back home. Their state budget doubled following the conquest of Pergamon in 130 AD and nearly doubled once more after taking Syria. During this era, the growth of Rome felt as inevitable as the water that once flooded through the Straits of Gibraltar. By the year 70 AD, this colossal empire completely encircled the Mediterranean. Rome's dominion now spanned from the snow-capped Scottish highlands in the north to the rolling sand dunes of the Sahara in the south. Stretching from the rocky Atlantic coastlines in the west all the way to the Arabian deserts in the east, the Romans and their subjects constructed a vast network of highways and postal outposts. They dotted the landscape with public baths and amphitheaters, launching a new era of technological advancement. However, this progress came at a steep price. They mercilessly took advantage of conquered territories and wiped out anyone who dared to stand against them with brutal efficiency. During the 2nd century, the empire was guided by 5 legendary rulers, including famous names like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. Even though conflicts raged on the frontiers, the interior of the empire enjoyed a golden age of stability and wealth. Sadly, this era of relative tranquility was doomed to end, and the first cracks in the foundation appeared as a catastrophic sickness. In the winter of 165 AD, Rome was locked in combat with the Parthian Empire, a superpower based in ancient Iran. Roman legions were laying siege to the Parthian city of Seleucia, near modern-day Baghdad, when soldiers started suffering from bizarre and alarming symptoms. Galen, a renowned Greek doctor, chronicled these terrifying events. He noted that by day 9, a patient would develop a mild cough, which intensified by the 10th day. After suffering from inflammation for a while, they would cough up scabs, followed by bright fresh blood and even pieces of the lining from their throat and windpipe. This frightening new contagion moved swiftly through the ranks. While we can't be 100% certain what this disease was, the symptoms suggest it was likely smallpox, perhaps even striking alongside a measles outbreak. Regardless of its specific nature, the sickness raced up the rivers of Mesopotamia to the city of Amida, where Romans were defending against a Parthian siege. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus painted a grim picture of the scene inside the city walls. He described streets so littered with dead bodies that there was no one left to perform proper burials. A pestilence soon joined the other disasters facing the citizens, with corpses rapidly decomposing into worms and rot due to the intense heat and widespread illness. Powerless against both the enemy army and the invisible pathogen, these Roman troops eventually headed back home. Unfortunately, they unknowingly carried that deadly enemy right into the core of the empire. The infection quickly tore through soldiers guarding the misty pine forests along the Rhine River before traveling south along the major trade arteries, eventually hitting the crowded streets of Rome itself. Lucian of Samosata, an Assyrian author, described homes in Rome left completely vacant, with magical spells and symbols painted on the doorways in a desperate attempt to keep out the evil lurking in the alleyways. Halfway across the world, records from China's Han Dynasty mention a similar plague erupting around the same time, pointing to a pandemic that spanned the entire globe. Historians call this catastrophe the Antonine Plague, and it is estimated to have wiped out roughly 2% of the empire's total population, about 2 million lives. In the hardest-hit regions, however, the death rate may have soared as high as 30 or 40%. This disaster crippled the empire at a pivotal moment. Vital industries, such as maritime trade, were absolutely destroyed, and the Roman military strength was severely depleted. Just as the sickness peaked, Rome's political stability collapsed as well. With corpses piling up in the streets, the brutal and self-centered Emperor Commodus took the throne, marking the start of Rome's long downward spiral. Before long, opposing generals were engaging in savage battles for the crown, razing cities and wasting the empire's resources on pointless, self-sabotaging civil wars by the end of the 3rd century. The massive Mediterranean empire had grown too large to be governed effectively from the decaying city that had originally birthed it. Rome was paralyzed by corruption, and its population was increasingly tormented by a sickness they blamed on bad air, or malaria in Latin, which is the same name we use for the disease today. In a frantic attempt to stabilize the ship and halt the internal fighting, Emperor Diocletian issued a decree in the year 285. He ordered a strict division of Rome's territories. Western Europe and Northwest Africa formed the Western Empire, which would be ruled not from Rome, but from Mediolanum, the city we now know as Milan. Meanwhile, the eastern regions, encompassing the modern lands of Greece, Turkey, Syria, Israel, and Egypt, became a separate entity that historians today refer to as the Eastern Roman Empire. To manage this, a system called the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four, was established, with 2 leaders governing each half of the map. The hope was that this shared power would finally stop the savage civil wars that were hollowing out the empire from the inside. Unfortunately, that plan failed completely. The Tetrarchy quickly collapsed, and civil war rocked the empire once again. This triggered a devastating 20-year conflict where Emperor Constantine battled his rivals for total control. Amidst this bloodshed, Constantine made the historic choice to convert to Christianity. This was a young faith centered on a Jewish rebel who had opposed the Roman occupation of Jerusalem, a religion that had long endured violent suppression by Roman authorities. Constantine eventually defeated his enemies, reunited the fractured empire under his sole command, and established Christianity as the official state religion. He then embarked on a project that was perhaps even more shocking to his contemporaries. Constantine resolved to build a brand new capital city in the east. After considering several options, he chose a location situated exactly where Europe meets Asia. It was a humble Greek trading town in the far eastern corner of the Mediterranean known to the Greeks as Byzantium. Interestingly, Constantine, a Latin speaker, would have referred to it by that same familiar name we recognize today. However, the massive Zanclean flood that originally filled the Mediterranean wasn't the only prehistoric deluge to hit this region. In fact, on the eastern shores near modern Turkey, another very similar cataclysm was about to occur on a slightly smaller, yet equally intense scale. Around 7,500 years ago, it is believed that the Mediterranean Sea's waters were pressing against a range of cliffs that blocked off a slender valley we now know as the Bosphorus. Behind this natural barricade lay a low-lying area containing a massive freshwater lake. However, as the Ice Age concluded and glaciers melted away, global sea levels rose. Likely assisted by the frequent earthquakes common in the region, the natural dam holding back the ocean eventually failed. Consequently, Mediterranean waters cascaded into the Bosphorus Valley in immense, unstoppable volumes. If this hypothesis is accurate, estimates suggest that up to 50 cubic kilometers of water surged over this ridge every single day. That volume represents roughly 200 times the flow rate of Niagara Falls. The terrain beyond was inundated with salt water, submerging an area of 100,000 square kilometers, which is approximately the size of Cuba. It is thought that Stone Age humans would have witnessed this deluge firsthand, and it surely must have been a horrifying spectacle, a story they likely passed down to their children and future generations. Actually, alongside the flooding of the Persian Gulf during this same era, this event has been proposed as a potential origin for the biblical tale of Noah's flood. This newly formed body of water would eventually be named the Black Sea. Today, its coastline is shared by the nations of Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. The slender valley that channeled this massive flood is the narrow marine passage we refer to as the Bosphorus. At its tightest section, this channel separates the continents of Europe and Asia by merely 750 meters of sea. Roughly 300 kilometers to the west lies a second narrow strait called the Dardanelles, where the ancient city of Troy once stood as a rival to the Bronze Age city-states of Greece. Sandwiched between these two slender gateways lies the Sea of Marmara, the smallest sea in the world, and it was in this exact location that the city of Byzantium was established. Byzantium began as an ancient Greek colony, founded by settlers from the powerful port city of Megara around the year 667 BC. Legend credits the city's establishment to a Megarian prince named Byzas, and the motivation for Byzas's journey reportedly came from the oracle at Delphi. Modern scientific analysis has revealed that this oracle was constructed over a site where volcanic gases escaped from fissures in the Earth's crust. The priestesses there would lower themselves into chambers filled with these vapors, which induced a trance-like state of hallucination, allowing them to deliver prophecies to visitors. According to this legend, the oracle at Delphi gave Prince Byzas a cryptic piece of advice. He must set sail and search for the land located opposite the City of the Blind. Following this guidance, Byzas navigated across the sea, passing through the tight Dardanelles Strait and entering the Sea of Marmara. There, he spotted exactly what he was looking for. On the Asian shore of the sea, a Greek colony called Chalcedon had already been established. However, Byzas instantly recognized that the European side offered a far superior location for a settlement, a highly defensible position boasting a spacious natural harbor. Byzas realized the settlers of Chalcedon must have been blind to overlook such a perfect spot. Thus, he had discovered the land opposite the City of the Blind. He went ashore and established a city there, naming it Byzantium in honor of himself. The strategic advantages Byzas identified in this location were truly formidable. The city sat right at the narrowest point of the Bosphorus Strait, where Asia lay less than a kilometer away across the water. This served as a natural bridge, controlling all land-based trade moving between the continents. Furthermore, it commanded all maritime traffic traveling between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. On top of that, the rapid currents rushing through the narrow channel made sea-based attacks extremely difficult for any enemy army. The city's harbor was a long, sliver-shaped river estuary, protected from the fast ocean currents and spacious enough to accommodate 1,000 ships. This inlet would eventually earn the name the Golden Horn, either because of the immense wealth that would flow through its waters in future ages, or perhaps for the vibrant yellow light that frequently blazed on its surface as the sun set over the sea. Nestled securely between the Sea of Marmara and the Golden Horn, Byzantium formed a distinct wedge shape. This geography meant that hostile forces could only approach the city from one specific direction, making it an ideal location to construct a nearly impregnable fortress. For much of its early existence, Byzantium was not a massive metropolis. It likely housed only around 40,000 residents, a small number compared to the million-plus population of Rome at its peak. However, despite its smaller size, the city was incredibly abundant. The Roman geographer Strabo documented the rich schools of fish that traveled annually through the tight channel of the Bosphorus. He noted that the horn, which sits near the city walls, looks very much like the horn of a stag. Young fish wander into this area and become trapped by the rushing currents and the tightness of the inlets. Strabo explains that they are so densely packed they can essentially be caught by hand, providing a significant source of revenue for the people of Byzantium and Rome. Yet, despite these natural defenses, the city was conquered multiple times by the Persian Empire as well as by Spartan and Athenian Greeks. It was even besieged and burned down by the ruthless Roman Emperor Septimius Severus during one of the empire's devastating civil wars. When Emperor Diocletian eventually divided the empire, Byzantium was selected to serve as the capital of the eastern half. Finally, in 330 AD, under Emperor Constantine. It was designated as the new imperial capital for the entire Roman Empire. A decree from the 4th century records Constantine's decision, stating that he resolved to transfer his rule and power to the east. He declared that a city bearing his name should be established on this excellent site in the province of Byzantium. Much like the ancient explorer Byzas, Constantine saw his own reflection in this golden location. He renamed the city Constantinople, meaning the city of Constantine, though in that era it was also known informally as Nova Roma, or the New Rome. In his new capital, Constantine immediately launched a colossal construction project intended to make Constantinople worthy of the empire. He established a new central square called the Augusteum in the heart of the old city. On its eastern side, a grand basilica and a new senate house were constructed, while the great palace of the emperor rose to the south. The Byzantine poet Marianas praised the city's beauty in those early years, describing how the land is cut in two by the winding channel that opens to the sea. He wrote that the divine emperor built his palace there so that, while ruling Rome, he could look out from Europe at a view in Asia that was worthy of him. Located near the imperial palace was the massive hippodrome used for chariot racing. Its track stretched 450 meters in length, with stands that could accommodate up to 100,000 spectators. 8 chariots, each powered by 4 horses, could race on the track simultaneously, creating what must have been an electric spectacle. Nearby stood the famous baths of Zeuxippus, which were decorated with opulent mosaics. A letter from the 5th century writer Leontius gives us a snapshot of the leisurely lifestyle in the city. He invites a friend to visit, noting that he has the pleasant Zeuxippus bath on one side and the racecourse on the other. He suggests that after watching the races and taking a bath, the friend should come rest at his table, assuring him that he will still have plenty of time to catch the afternoon races since the track is right near his room. Constantinople even erected its own obelisk in the hippodrome, built from square stone blocks to a height of 32 meters. This was exactly the same height as the obelisk standing in Rome's Circus Maximus, a deliberate statement intended to show that Constantinople was equal in every way to the Eternal City. Around the year 330, Constantine also constructed an imposing wall running between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, sealing off the wedge-shaped city to maximize its defensibility. The first Christian emperor claimed that an angel had guided him regarding where to place the fortifications. He built them a great distance from the old city walls, which was an impressive prediction of how large he expected his new capital to become. He was right. In the following century, Byzantium expanded at a tremendous rate, and by the early 400s, the city had spilled out beyond Constantine's ambitious boundaries. Today, we can track the city's expansion by looking at the advancing rings of its walls, which grew outward much like the rings of a tree. By the year 404, the Eastern Emperor, a man named Theodosius, the Seond, embarked on an even more aggressive building project to protect the growing city. He constructed a new set of walls 2 kilometers to the west. These fortifications stretched for 6.5 kilometers and massively increased the enclosed area of the capital. However, while these walls demonstrated the ambition of an expanding city, they also served as proof of the increasingly dangerous world surrounding the young capital. When viewing the situation Emperor Theodosius faced when he began building these defenses, it is easy to see why he deemed them necessary. Around this time, massive migrations of people were being driven out of the Eurasian steppes by a mysterious force, crossing into Roman territory en masse. The Roman state, already crippled by civil war, was struggling to cope with these external pressures. Around the year 399, the writer Synesius captured the mood of impending doom in a speech to Emperor Arcadius, declaring that everything balanced on a razor's edge, and that the state required the assistance of both God and the emperor to crush the dangers plaguing the empire. Then, just 2 years into the reign of Emperor Theodosius II, in 410 AD, news arrived of an unthinkable tragedy. An army of Goths commanded by the general Alaric had besieged the great city of Rome 3 separate times, and on the third attempt, they burst through the gates and sacked the city. Although this sacking was relatively restrained by the brutal standards of the era, it was an event that shattered the psychological foundation of the world. Writing a decade later, St. Melania the Younger described the horror, noting that a barbarian storm foretold by prophecy had fallen upon Rome. She recounted how the invaders spared nothing, not even the bronze statues in the Forum, turning a city beautified over 1,200 years into a ruin. St. Jerome, a native of the West living in Bethlehem, reacted with a passionate outburst of sorrow, writing, "O horrid, the universe tumbles, and yet our sins do not fall." He lamented that the renowned head of the Roman Empire had been consumed in a single blaze. This disaster sent waves of refugees fleeing across the Mediterranean, piling into boats to reach the shores of Africa, Egypt, and the East. Jerome documented the desperate plight of these survivors, asking who could believe that Rome, built through the conquest of the world, had collapsed, or that the mother of nations had become a tomb. He described the shores of the East filling with the hosts of Rome's former servants. Tragically, when these starving and thirsty refugees landed, locals saw their fine clothes and assumed they were smuggling hidden wealth. Jerome recalled that people could hardly believe mighty Rome, with its careless security and riches, was reduced to begging for food and shelter. In a display of cruelty, some locals, instead of offering compassion, tore apart the refugees' bundles and rags, expecting to find gold on people who were now nothing more than prisoners of circumstance. Emperor Theodosius was determined to ensure his capital of Constantinople would never suffer Rome's fate. Consequently, the fortifications he commissioned in the following years became one of the most imposing defensive structures in history. The design featured a triple line of defense, with 3 walls arranged one after another, each rising taller than the last, protected by a wide moat. This moat utilized an ingenious pipe system that allowed defenders to flood it instantly if the city was threatened. The final and tallest wall was nearly 5 meters thick and 12 meters high, studded with 96 towers that reached a height of 20 meters. Constructed from precisely cut blocks of white limestone banded with lines of red brick, these walls would have gleamed brilliant white in the sunlight. They were so formidable that they would remain unbreached for 1,000 years, requiring a total revolution in military technology to finally bring them down. These defenses were completed just in time, for as the final stones were laid, they faced a nightmare scenario. In the decades since the initial migrations began, the identity of the mysterious force driving nomads out of Asia had become clear. That force was the Huns. They would soon be commanded by a man whose shadow would darken all of Europe. His predecessors had already united the nomadic tribes of the Russian steppes into a terrifying power, but he would lead them west in a campaign of destruction with few historical equals. That man was Attila. The Huns were originally a nomadic people from Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe, a society of pastoral warriors subsisting on the meat and milk of their herds. Initially, they had refrained from attacking Roman territory, and the Romans had even employed them as mercenaries, paying them to stay away. However, the rise of Attila changed everything. The 5th-century historian Priscus of Panium described Attila as a man born into the world to shake the nations, calling him the scourge of all lands. Priscus noted Attila's haughty walk and rolling eyes, which displayed the power of his proud spirit, marking him as a true lover of war. Upon becoming king of the Huns, Attila launched an aggressive expansion into Roman lands. He shattered previous treaties and began raiding cities, while the Roman army, weakened by the empire's internal troubles, could do little to stop him. Attila conquered territory throughout Gaul and modern France, establishing a massive Hunnic empire across Eastern and Central Europe. In 447 AD, he marched his forces across the Danube, striking directly at the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Romans were immediately overwhelmed along the border. Forts burned, pillars of smoke blackened the sky, and Attila's armies bore down on the center of their world, Constantinople. The Byzantine monk Callinicus, in his work The Life of St. Hypatius, wrote of the dire situation, stating that the barbarian nation of the Huns had captured more than 100 cities in Thrace. He recounted that the dead were too numerous to count, as the invaders seized churches and monasteries, slaying monks and maidens in great numbers. To make matters worse, the formidable walls of Constantinople suddenly could not be relied upon. In January of 447, the ground shook with terrifying violence. This earthquake was the strongest in living memory, perhaps in the city's entire history. For 4 months, tremors and subsequent floods ravaged the area, causing enormous loss of life. Buildings across Constantinople collapsed, leaving the skyline broken by fallen roofs and crumbling masonry, while people lay buried in the rubble. Most terrifying of all, the tremors brought down a massive section of the great Theodosian Walls, the only barrier standing between the citizens and Attila's approaching army. For the people of Constantinople, the situation was nightmare-inducing. These walls had taken over 9 years to build, and now one man was charged with the seemingly impossible task of repairing them in just a few months. This man was the prefect Constantinus, a native of Phrygia in modern Turkey. Although new to his post and facing a monumental challenge, Constantinus knew the city possessed one great untapped resource: its immense spirit of competition. He went to the city's vast hippodrome, which had become the hub of social life since its renovation by Emperor Constantine. Chariot racing in Byzantium commanded a fanatic devotion similar to modern football, and like football, it was a big-money business dominated by major racing teams. On the sands of the hippodrome, these factions were distinguished by color: the reds, blues, whites, and greens. Each group maintained deep ties to specific political parties within the Byzantine Senate. Much like our modern sports clubs, fierce rivalries divided these teams and their massive fan bases. Riots were a standard occurrence at the racecourse, and it wasn't unusual for people to die when rival gangs of these hooligans clashed. On that particular morning, Constantinus arrived at the hippodrome, perhaps trembling slightly at the sheer scale of the job ahead of him. He raised his hands and made a straightforward proposal to the racing gangs gathered there. He told them the city was in imminent peril. These sports clubs were tasked with reconstructing the city walls. Each faction would be assigned a specific section to finish, and they needed to recruit every available supporter to assist. The call for a competition was impossible to ignore. These gangs fanned out across the city's taverns, public squares, bathhouses, and spice markets. They pulled as many people as they could from the streets, telling them that their team's pride, and perhaps as a secondary thought for some, the city's survival, hung in the balance. Through this method, over 16,000 laborers were assembled to repair Constantinople's defenses. We can picture the chaotic energy as these hordes of sports fanatics scaled the scaffolding carrying stones, bricks, and mortar. They belted out their team anthems and mocked their rivals while working together to rebuild the fallen barriers. This effort was so successful that the city walls were fully restored and even strengthened in certain areas within a mere 2 months. A brief inscription carved into the base of the walls remains the only monument to this incredible feat, likening the achievement to Pallas, the mythological titan of war. It reads that, by the command of Theodosius, Constantinus triumphantly erected these strong walls in under 2 months, noting that even Pallas could hardly build such a strong citadel so quickly. We can visualize the look on Attila's face when he reached the gates of Constantinople. Instead of the earthquake-shattered ruins he had been promised, he found a triple line of defensive walls, their white limestone shining in the sun, the most formidable fortification in the known world. The conflict reached a stalemate. Attila could not breach the city, yet the Byzantines could not defeat him in open battle. Eventually, they signed a treaty. The Romans agreed to increase their payments to the Huns, and Attila departed the lands of Byzantium. Constantinople was secure, ensuring the Eastern Roman Empire would survive. However, the pressure raining down on its sister power, the Western Roman Empire, would prove too great. As the 5th century moved forward, one side of the empire would endure while the other would collapse into the dust. The landscapes of Byzantium spanned 2 continents, covering a vast array of temperatures and climates. Historically, these lands had always been the most populated, wealthy, and well-developed of all Roman territories. In fact, during the late Empire period, the East boasted a budget 3 times the size of the West and an army twice as large. In Europe, the heart of the Eastern Empire was the Balkans, including Greece, while in Asia, the core was the region known as Anatolia or Asia Minor, roughly the area of modern-day Turkey. The empire's European holdings covered parts of modern Albania, Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Greece. Here, dense forests blanket craggy mountains, dividing the area into steep river valleys that flow into the Adriatic, Aegean, and Mediterranean seas. The most fertile soil here lies along the Danube, Europe's second-longest river. The northern temperate regions share a climate very similar to northern Europe, allowing coastal farmers to grow grains and vegetables alongside fruit trees like apples, cherries, figs, pears, and pomegranates. Olive trees thrive here in great numbers, surviving well on the rocky soil, while terraced orchards and vineyards sit inland, and the higher mountain elevations are used for herding sheep and goats. Across the narrow channel of the Bosphorus lies Anatolia. In the west, the earth lifts gently from the Aegean Sea to form a fertile coastal plain where Greeks once established city-state colonies. However, massive mountains loom in the north and south, including the range known as the Taurus. These peaks create a nearly solid wall along the length of southern Turkey, breached only by the famous Cilician Gates, a path through the rocky hills along a narrow gorge that took about 5 days to traverse in ancient times, leading travelers out of Anatolia and into Syria. During the Byzantine era, much of this land wasn't suitable for crop production, but the sloping plateaus of Anatolia were perfect for raising vast pastures. Medieval writers frequently mentioned the enormous herds of cattle, goats, and sheep that roamed there. Despite the administrative division of the empire, the Romans of that time didn't consider their empire to have been split. For much of their shared history, Romans in both halves viewed it as a single entity, simply governed by 2 different imperial courts. However, significant differences existed between the 2 halves. The overwhelming culture of the East was Greek, and the Byzantines spoke the Greek language throughout their history, in contrast to Western Rome, which spoke Latin. Yet the people of the Byzantine Empire never referred to themselves as Greek. Even the name Byzantine is a much later invention. In fact, right through the Middle Ages until the end of their history, they referred to themselves simply as Romans and their lands as Romania. Byzantine rulers were actually greatly offended whenever Westerners referred to them as the Emperor of the Greeks. The people of Constantinople viewed their city and the city of Rome as what the Byzantine philosopher Themistius described as the world's 2 mother cities. However, he argued that Constantinople deserves just a little more credit, since it had to build itself up from nothing, and yet did the 2 mother cities of the world. He stated that of all the places that have wronged him, none did so less than Constantinople. It is ours, he would argue, and exists in greater harmony because she had no prior association with a race of rulers. Yet, through her virtue, she became a partner in empire with the great city. Back in the year 381, Gregory of Nazianzus, the theologian and Archbishop of Constantinople, described how these 2 capitals appeared like a light to the world. He noted that while nature does not give us 2 suns, it has given us 2 Romes, beacons for the entire globe. One might outshine the sun while the other outshines the evening star, but they hold a beauty to match beauty, forming a perfectly balanced pair. It is hard to imagine how it must have felt during this era to be a citizen of Constantinople, listening to stories about what was transpiring in the West, while the administrative heart of the emperor's court had relocated elsewhere. In the 4th century, the city of Rome remained the symbolic core of a powerful empire and the home of an immensely wealthy aristocracy holding estates across the Mediterranean. However, as the 5th century dawned, its position began to falter. Just 45 years after Alaric destroyed the city, a second sacking by the Vandals halved the population once again. By this time, Rome's influence reached no further than the borders of the Italian peninsula. Despite its claims to power, wealth no longer flowed to it from the rest of the empire, and the complex economic web situated at its heart began to unravel. We can see the decline of Rome written in the stones of its buildings. One example is the massive Basilica Aemilia, which stood next to the Senate House. It was destroyed by fire sometime in the 5th century, possibly during one of the sacks of the city. While the Romans rebuilt its outside facade, making sure it looked suitably grand to onlookers, they never repaired its interior. This building presented a grand face to the world, while inside it was a burned-out shell. And by this time, the same could be said for the whole city of Rome and the western part of its empire. Excavations have shown that, by the mid-5th century, rubbish was being dumped within Rome's great monumental buildings, that the structures themselves were beginning to crumble, and that new rough paths were being cut by people walking and dragging carts and horses through its fine gardens and monuments. By the 470s, the Roman emperor in the west, who now ruled from the city of Ravenna, was little more than an Italian warlord. Rome could no longer pay to maintain its legions and increasingly relied on the services of German mercenaries. Eventually, they could no longer pay these either. When one group of mercenaries known as the Heruli demanded lands in Italy as payment, the Romans refused. The Heruli rebelled, and the remnants of the Roman army were defeated in the Battle of Ravenna in the year 476. The Roman emperor was forced to resign, and the Western Empire vanished as a political entity entirely. For those in the East watching this collapse over the 5th century, it must have sent chills down their spine. The writer St. Jerome encapsulated what must have been the fear and uncertainty of that age, asking, "What is safe if Rome perishes?" But for the most part, life in the East was virtually unaffected by the fall of the West. In fact, Constantinople continued its expansion and rise in importance, becoming the undisputed capital and center of the Mediterranean world. Throughout the whole period of Rome's collapse, the East was seen as a safe haven, and it must have received an influx of refugees fleeing the destruction in the West. One writer, Paulinus of Pella, writes in his work Eucharisticos that he considered leaving the West and heading back to his Byzantine estates in Greece and Albania. His wife ultimately convinced him that the journey would be too dangerous, but we can assume that many did make this trip, swelling the population of the East and its capital of Constantinople. This was the beginning of the city's role as a sanctuary to the destitute, the city that later poets would refer to as the refuge of strangers, the beloved refuge for strangers, queen of the queens of cities, song of songs, and splendor of splendors. For the Christians of the East, the fall of Rome posed a religious conundrum. The empire had converted to Christianity little more than a century earlier, and now destruction was raining down on it from all sides. Many back in Rome believed that this was a punishment for abandoning their ancient pagan gods. However, Christian scholars in the East were busy arguing that it was actually the remnants of paganism that had brought about the collapse. As the writer Nilus describes, "You have said that hordes of barbarians have often invaded Romania because everyone was not willing or eager to worship the pagan gods with sacrifices. No, however, something more distinct and unveiled is happening. The inroads of the barbarians, earthquakes, conflagrations, and all other grievous things are occurring for no other reason than the wickedness and foolishness of the superstitious and impious men among you who refuse to end their idolatry, but instead continue to sacrifice to worthless deities every day in the suburbs." Despite these internal struggles, the eastern half of the empire actually weathered the tremors of the 5th century quite well. While it did suffer some damage from Hun and Ostrogoth invasions, the state ultimately managed to simply pay these attackers to go away. The region was also harassed by Vandal pirates sailing from bases in North Africa, and by nomadic tribes in Upper Egypt known as the Blemmyes and Nobades, but these enemies inflicted no permanent harm. Soon enough, one man, an emperor of the East, would launch a crusade to recover the fragmented lands that had once belonged to the Western Empire. He was one of the most remarkable characters in history, and his name was Justinian. The story of Justinian actually begins with his uncle, a man named Justin. Justin was a prime example of one unique aspect of Byzantine society, the ability of almost anyone to rise through the ranks and reach the very pinnacle of imperial power. In fact, Justin began his life as a swineherd in the region of Dardania, a mountainous area in the Balkans right next to Macedonia. As a teenager, he and two friends fled the chaos engulfing the West. They crossed mountain passes, likely marching within columns of refugees while the smoke of their homeland rose into the skies behind them. Everyone in that line had only one name on their lips, the only place in the world that seemed like a safe harbor at that moment, the refuge of strangers, the city of Constantinople. The historian Procopius provides a specific account of this humble journey. He writes that 3 young farmers of Illyrian origin set out from Badiriana, determined to join the army. They covered the entire distance to Byzantium on foot, carrying nothing on their shoulders but their cloaks. Inside those cloaks, upon arrival, they had nothing except for twice-baked bread they had prepared back home. When they arrived at the great capital, life must have been difficult. Justin spoke Latin but knew only very simple Greek, so he must have felt lost in the chaotic mix of languages spoken in Constantinople. Like most peasants, he was illiterate, yet he managed to secure a spot in the palace guard. He rose through the ranks of military life to become a tribune, then a senator, and finally, under Emperor Anastasius, he was appointed commander of the palace guard. When the emperor died, as so often happened with Byzantine rulers, the palace exploded in intrigue. The Grand Chamberlain, a man named Amantius, is said to have given a large sum of money to Justin, intending to buy his support. Instead, Justin took the money and distributed it to numerous other people to ensure their loyalty to him. When the dust settled, it was Justin who was elected as the new emperor. Justin soon reached out to his peasant family and brought his young nephew, a boy named Justinian, to the capital to be educated. Justinian was also a peasant, but in Constantinople, he studied jurisprudence, theology, and Roman history. He learned about the greatness of the empire that had once ruled the West and about the circumstances of its catastrophic fall. Perhaps it is here that he began to dream of an ambitious and seemingly impossible project. This he would later call the Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire. Justinian became emperor after his uncle's death, and he set about the job of ruling with enormous energy. He became known as the emperor who never sleeps, but his reign was not without controversy. He married a lower-class woman named Theodora, a courtesan with a lascivious reputation, and this caused a massive scandal across the empire. The contradictory and contrasting ways Justinian has been portrayed are nowhere better shown than in the writings of the scholar Procopius. Early in his life, Procopius writes about Justinian and Theodora as a deeply religious and devoted pair. However, later in life, he penned a controversial exposé titled the Anecdota, or Secret History. In this scandalous work, Procopius depicts Emperor Justinian as a vicious and inept tyrant. He claims the emperor committed countless murders under the guise of religious zeal, recklessly killing anyone who did not adhere to his specific version of Christian doctrine. To Justinian, executing those with different beliefs did not even count as murder. Procopius goes to great lengths in his accusations, even suggesting that the emperor and empress were possessed by demonic forces. He shares stories of them roaming the palace without their heads. Some pure-spirited men who were with Justinian late at night claimed to see a strange, demonic shape sitting on the throne. One witness swore that, when the emperor stood up and walked around, his head suddenly disappeared while his body seemed to dissolve and shapeshift, leaving the observer terrified and questioning his own sanity. Justinian's reign was also plagued by violent unrest. In the year 532, the city's famous chariot racing factions, rival gangs who had previously united to defend the walls against Attila, joined forces once again, this time to revolt against the corruption of Justinian's government. They rampaged through the capital's streets, setting fires and chanting Nika, the Greek word for victory. These events became known as the Nika riots, and the situation grew so dire that the emperor considered escaping by boat. During the chaos, the ancient church located on the hill near the imperial palace was burned to the ground. Justinian's response was ruthless. Over the following days, he ordered the army to crush the rebellion. Procopius records that 30,000 citizens were slaughtered, staining the sands of the hippodrome with their blood. Regardless of his true character, Justinian was undeniably ambitious. In the aftermath of the violence, he resolved to rebuild the city. On the charred site of the old church, he commissioned a new cathedral designed to rival St. Peter's in Rome. The result was one of the most extraordinary structures in history. Marbles and columns were shipped in from every corner of the empire, and over 10,000 workers were employed in its construction. Its massive dome soars 55 meters into the air with a span of 30 meters. This is the Church of Holy Wisdom, commonly known by its Greek name, the Hagia Sophia, which remains a globally recognized landmark today. Justinian was also determined to maximize his empire's economic power, achieving this through what might be history's first act of corporate espionage: the theft of silk secrets from China. As mentioned previously, silk had been the exclusive monopoly of Chinese craftsmen for centuries, reaching the wider world long before formal diplomatic contact existed. However, in 551 AD, two Byzantine monks preaching in India traveled to China and observed the complex methods used to raise silkworms and produce the fabric. They rushed back to Constantinople to secure an urgent meeting with Emperor Justinian. They informed him that they had located the source of the miraculous material. Impressed, the emperor promised them a vast fortune if they could smuggle these mysterious worms back to the capital. The monks set out again, likely taking a northern route along the Black Sea, passing through the Tarim Basin and the Taklamakan Desert, through the Jade Gate, and down the Hexi Corridor into the Chinese heartland. They carried hollow bamboo canes with hidden compartments to conceal their cargo. Inside China, they arranged for others to smuggle the silkworms out, likely as eggs or very young larvae, since adult worms are too fragile to survive temperature changes. The entire mission may have taken 2 years, but they returned successfully, establishing a silkworm population at the western end of the Silk Road. Their success launched a Byzantine silk industry, with factories springing up in Constantinople, Beirut, Antioch, and Thebes. The empire quickly secured a monopoly on silk in Europe, which became a cornerstone of their economy throughout the medieval era and swelled the wealth of Byzantium to unprecedented levels. By the early 6th century, Constantinople was unrivaled in Europe. It had constructed the ancient world's longest aqueduct system, winding 250 kilometers through the countryside. Earlier emperors had also bolstered the city's defenses with the Long Walls, a defensive line located over 60 kilometers from the capital, stretching 56 kilometers from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara. Yet Justinian harbored even grander ambitions. He sought to reclaim all the lost territories of the Western Roman Empire and restore Rome to its former size, a goal in which he would be incredibly successful. Justinian never fought in these campaigns himself. He delegated command to a brilliant general named Belisarius. From his throne in Constantinople, Justinian watched as the old Roman lands were brought back under his banner. General Belisarius marched across North Africa, conquering the occupying Vandals in just 9 months. He then turned his attention to Italy, which was ruled by an Ostrogoth king. Belisarius swept into Italy, besieged Rome for over a year, and finally marched through its gates in 536 AD. When Belisarius entered Rome, he found a city that was a shadow of its past greatness. 2 major earthquakes in the 5th century had damaged many of its grand structures, though the aqueducts and baths still functioned. Gladiators and animals still fought in the Colosseum, and the diminished population was beginning to reclaim some importance in the region, even if it was nothing like the European empire they once commanded. For Justinian and Belisarius, holding Rome was the ultimate symbol of a restored empire, and they refused to surrender it. The Ostrogoth king of Italy, a man named Witiges, responded quickly, marching on Rome with his own army. Now it was Belisarius who found himself under siege. The Ostrogoth king offered him and his men safe passage if they surrendered the city. Belisarius responded with this reply: "It was you who trespassed upon this city in the past, even though it never truly belonged to you. Now, however reluctantly, you have handed it back to its ancient owners. Any of you hoping to enter Rome without a fight is mistaken. As long as Belisarius lives, he will never surrender this city." The Romans ultimately succeeded in keeping the city, but this was only the start of a long, costly series of wars in Italy. In the years that followed, Rome would be besieged and captured 3 more times, with each instance becoming more brutal and expensive than the last. Finally, the Ostrogoth hold on Italy broke, and the Byzantine Empire reclaimed the Eternal City for Rome. However, there was a tragic irony to the situation. In attempting to return Rome to the empire, the Byzantines had devastated the city during Belisarius's wars. Perhaps 90% of Rome's citizens were killed or had fled, leaving a population of only about 30,000 people. The inhabited area was reduced to a tenth of its previous size, and of the 13 great aqueducts that once brought water to the city, only 2 still worked. If there had ever been hope of restoring Rome's ancient glory, the Byzantines had extinguished it forever. Moreover, Justinian's conquests, though remarkable achievements, were short-lived. The empire simply didn't have the resources to hold such a large territory for any length of time. The Gothic wars drained its wealth and distracted the military, and in the 540s, a plague spread across Europe, weakening it further. The so-called Plague of Justinian may have killed between 25 and 100 million people over the next 2 centuries. Modern science confirms it was caused by a strain of Yersinia pestis, the same organism behind the medieval Black Death. The Constantinople outbreak likely arrived via infected rats on grain ships from Egypt. Emperor Justinian himself reportedly caught the disease, though he was one of the 50% who recovered. Procopius records that at its peak, the plague killed 10,000 people daily in Constantinople, and of course, he blames Justinian for its arrival. He wrote that the plague raged, sweeping away nearly half the survivors, claiming these were the disasters afflicting mankind from the day Justinian began managing the kingdom and took the throne. Procopius also reserves harsh words for Justinian's reaction to the plague and his refusal to support the empire's suffering peasants. When pestilence swept the known world and the Roman Empire, wiping out the farming community and leaving desolation, Justinian showed no mercy to the ruined freeholders. Even then, he continued demanding the annual tax. The plague weakened the Byzantine Empire at a critical point, right when Justinian's armies had nearly retaken control of Italy and the western Mediterranean coast. However, the Germanic people known as the Lombards soon invaded northern Italy, crushing the small Byzantine force stationed there and establishing their own kingdom. The dream of restoring the ancient empire had effectively died. Nature itself seemed to signal this decline. During the 550s, 2 earthquakes rocked the capital of Constantinople. In a moment heavy with symbolism, the massive dome of the Hagia Sophia cracked, and a final quake in the year 558 caused the structure to collapse completely. To the citizens of the city, this disaster likely appeared as God's final judgment upon an emperor who had reached for such lofty ambitions only to fall so short in the end. Justinian passed away in the year 565 without leaving any children. He was laid to rest in a magnificent mausoleum within the Church of the Holy Apostles, leaving his successors to deal with the fallout of his overambitious campaigns. Although Justinian had started with an imperial treasury containing 29 million gold coins, his wars had drained it to almost nothing. In the east, Byzantium faced renewed pressure from the powerful Sassanid Empire. A Persian superpower ruled from the city of Ctesiphon near modern-day Baghdad. Conflicts with the Sassanids dragged on for decades, exhausting both empires and resulting in a bitter, expensive stalemate. By the year 630, the empire had once again lost most of Italy and North Africa, retaining only a foothold on the island of Sicily. However, in the early 7th century, an emperor named Heraclius appeared poised to return the empire to its former glory. Ruling for 30 years, he won a remarkable string of battles, pushing the Sassanids back into Anatolia and even recapturing the holy city of Jerusalem in 629. In a lavish, triumphant ceremony, Heraclius returned the relic of the true cross to Jerusalem. For a brief moment, it must have seemed that he was guiding the empire toward a new golden age. But unbeknownst to the people of Byzantium, a new rival was emerging from a most unexpected place: the seemingly empty desert sands of Arabia. The Arabian Peninsula acts as a wedge of land separating the Persian Gulf in the north from the Red Sea in the south. Technically a subcontinent, it sits on its own tectonic plate. Over millions of years, it has torn away from Africa in the south while slowly crashing into the Eurasian plate in the north, a collision that forced up Iran's Zagros Mountains. This arid land is a mix of rocky mountains and dry coastlines bordered by coral reefs, separated by narrow strips of fertile pastures in the valleys. Most famously, the region is defined by a vast array of deserts. The largest of these, the Great Arabian Desert, is the 5th largest in the world and one of the deepest, with sands estimated to extend up to 180 meters, or more than 50 stories, below the surface. It was here that a warrior visionary rose to challenge the region's established powers, gathering a formidable military force. The man history knows as Mohammed was a revolutionary, a guerrilla fighter, a poet, and an innovative strategist. During the last decade of his life, he led a successful campaign to take the city of Mecca from the Quraysh tribe, who had ruled it for centuries. Following his death in the year 632, his successors set their sights on the lands of the Sassanids in Mesopotamia and Persia, as well as the Byzantine territories in Egypt. Both of these ancient giants had been hollowed out from within, weakened and bankrupted by their ceaseless fighting. The last major war between them had ended only a few years prior, having ground on for nearly 3 decades. The Arab advance caught them completely by surprise. The Byzantines were so distracted by their own wars that they paid little attention to the news filtering across the southern desert. They had even stopped paying tribute to the desert tribes they typically relied on for intelligence. In 634, shocking the entire world, Arab armies defeated a Byzantine force sent into Syria and captured Damascus in a lightning-fast strike. The Byzantines attempted a counterattack in 636, but a sandstorm scattered their troops, and when the Arab cavalry bore down on them, they were utterly annihilated. These Arab forces fought with swords crafted from the finest Indian steel, riding camels and horses that were fast and versatile across the desert terrain. Their tactics were largely defensive, tricking opponents into ill-advised attacks against large groups of archers positioned on the flanks. The only remaining hope for the Byzantines was that their great rivals, the Sassanids, would stop the Arab advance. But that hope was in vain. In fact, the Arab attacks led to the total disintegration of the Sassanid Empire. 4 centuries later, the Persian poet Ferdowsi penned a lament about the end of this great power, cursing the world, time, and fate. He asked where the valiant warriors, priests, hunting parties, and feasts had gone, wondering what happened to the warlike spirit and the great armies that once destroyed the country's enemies. He described the land as a ruin, a lair for lions and leopards, telling the reader to look now and despair. The Byzantines watched helplessly as their territories in Asia were consumed. Jerusalem, which had been recaptured at such enormous cost less than 10 years earlier, surrendered to Arab armies in 637. For the Emperor-General Heraclius, upon whom so many hopes had been pinned, this catastrophic defeat was too much to bear. Once a bold sailor who commanded his father's fleet, he developed an overwhelming hydrophobia, a fear of the sea in his old age. On his return to Constantinople from Asia, he found even the 700-meter crossing of the Bosphorus too terrifying. His men were forced to tie boats together across the entire span, covering them with shrubs and mats so the frightened old emperor wouldn't see the deep, dark water rocking beneath him. When Egypt fell to Arab forces in 642, the Byzantine Empire lost its primary source of grain for the capital. This supply chain had existed since the days of the ancient Romans, and now the empire's entire economic structure had to be reorganized overnight. Food shortages were added to the growing list of imperial problems. By 647, the advancing Arab armies had taken the ancient city of Carthage, the last Byzantine territory in Africa. To the horror of the Byzantines, the Arab Empire began constructing a navy in 644. Within a decade, it was strong enough to raid the islands of Cyprus and Rhodes, neither of which could offer even a scrap of resistance. It soon became undeniable that Byzantium could no longer defend its empire. In 655, Emperor Constans personally set sail with the Byzantine navy, the pride of the empire and its final line of defense, to engage the Arab fleet. The writer Theophanes the Confessor recounted the disaster. He described how Muawiyah ordered a massive naval armament to sail against Constantinople. The fleet arrived at Phoenix in Lycia, where Emperor Constans was stationed with the Roman fleet. The emperor, having failed to organize his battle lines properly, ordered his ships to fight. In the ensuing struggle, the Romans were defeated, and the sea was dyed red with blood. 500 Byzantine ships were destroyed. Emperor Constans was forced to exchange clothes with another man and flee disguised as a common soldier, a stinging humiliation for the Byzantine ruler. The brave man who donned the imperial robes stationed himself on the emperor's ship, killing many enemies before giving his life. The enemy, surrounding him and believing he was the emperor, killed him after a fierce fight. Meanwhile, the routed emperor escaped, leaving everyone else behind as he sailed back to Constantinople. The city of Constantinople was now completely defenseless. With firm control over Syria and the Mediterranean coast, Arab armies sent frequent raiding parties deep into Anatolia. By 674, they felt bold enough to strike at the great city itself. The Arab fleet started by capturing coastal port towns and establishing a blockade of Constantinople, attempting to choke the life out of the city. Theophanes the Confessor recalled these events, noting that in March of that year, a rainbow appeared in the sky, causing all mankind to shudder as everyone believed it signaled the end of the world. In that year, the deniers of Christ prepared a massive expedition. The emperor at the time, Constantine IV, must have wondered if this was truly the end of the empire that had once ruled all of Europe. However, the Byzantines had one final trick up their sleeve. In recent years, they had developed a secret superweapon of such terrifying power that it would soon become famous worldwide. This weapon was so mysterious that scholars today still debate its exact composition, and the Byzantines guarded its secrets so jealously that its name became synonymous with the Greeks who created it: Greek fire. While incendiary weapons like flaming arrows and pots of combustible materials had been used since the Assyrians in the 9th century BC, the substance known as Greek fire was unique. It was reportedly invented by a man named Callinicos, a refugee who had fled the Arab conquests and found sanctuary in Constantinople. This city, which had seen refugees rise to become emperors, now received the secret of its survival from those same huddled masses. The medieval writer Anna Komnene provided an account thought to describe this terrifying weapon. She explained that flammable resin collected from pine and other evergreen trees was rubbed with sulfur and placed into reed tubes. Men would then blow through these tubes with violent, continuous breath, causing the mixture to catch fire at the tip and fall upon the faces of the enemy like a fiery whirlwind. The refugee Callinicos is said to have demonstrated this Greek fire to the Byzantine emperor. It was a flaming substance, possibly petroleum-based, that appeared to set the very surface of the sea on fire. Water could not douse the flames. Some accounts suggest water only made them burn more intensely. Its use was accompanied by smoke and thunderous noise. One remarkable Norse saga tells of a Viking warrior named Ingvar the Far-Traveled, who sailed down the Volga River into the Caspian Sea to explore Asia. Ingvar apparently encountered ships equipped with Greek fire. The saga describes a furnace with fire inside, blown by smith's bellows, creating a great din. A brass or bronze tube projected from it, shooting so much fire against a ship that it burned to white ashes in a short time. Whatever its exact chemical makeup, we know the devastating effect the weapon had. The writer Theophanes recalled the dramatic events as Arab ships bore down on the great city. When Constantine learned of the enemy's movement against Constantinople, he prepared massive two-story warships equipped with Greek fire and siphon-carrying vessels, anchoring them in the harbor. Combat raged from dawn until dusk, stretching from the Golden Gate to Kiklobian. With the aid of God and his mother, the Byzantines disgraced the enemy. After expending a host of warlike men, the Arab forces retreated in great distress and with severe wounds. As the expedition departed, having been ruined by God, it was overtaken by a violent winter storm near Cilium which shattered the fleet to atoms, completely destroying it. This naval defeat was coupled with a Byzantine victory on land, forcing the Arab forces to withdraw with enormous losses. Growing divisions within their own lands soon forced the Arabs to attend to their own affairs, and a peace deal was struck. A second siege of Constantinople was attempted at the beginning of the 8th century, but once again, the use of Greek fire drove the enemy armies back. The Byzantine Empire had survived yet another existential threat, and the city of Constantinople remained the impregnable fortress that Emperor Theodosius had hoped for. Over the next few centuries, storm after storm would rage against Constantinople, but the city would always hold. Its powerful walls, its natural defenses, and the ingenious invention of Greek fire would keep it safe from its enemies. With that safety secured, let's fast-forward the story to the 10th century and pause to explore what daily existence was actually like inside the Byzantine Empire. For the locals, Constantinople was a source of immense pride. They referred to it as the reigning city and the eye of the world. Above the rooftops, banners displaying the Byzantine crescent moon would have snapped and fluttered in the wind. Because the city sat directly on the route to the Holy Land, pilgrims and travelers constantly passed through, leaving behind vivid descriptions of its grandeur. One Russian visitor, Stefan of Novgorod, compared entering Constantinople to walking into a vast forest. He noted that it was impossible to navigate without a professional guide, and if you tried to explore cheaply without offering tips, you wouldn't be allowed to see or kiss a single holy relic. Another pilgrim, known as Fordy, wrote about the overwhelming wealth of the icon houses and churches. He claimed it was impossible to visit every monastery or list the thousands of saintly relics and miracles found there. Fordy even witnessed a formal imperial procession, though he had a rough run-in with the heavy-handed security. He recounted how he and his group went to the palace, but he quickly lost his friends in the crush. To get a better view, he climbed onto the base of a pillar. From there, he caught a glimpse of the imperial family entering, wearing golden crowns and robes embroidered with the most luxurious gold thread imaginable. However, as the ceremony began, guards rudely shoved him off the pillar, sending him sprawling onto the stone floor. Some of these enforcers may have belonged to the famous Varangian Guard, a unit comprised of Viking warriors from Scandinavia. Wandering the city during this era, visitors would have walked down narrow streets flanked by buildings made of orange-brown bricks, still produced using ancient Roman methods. The air would be filled with the ringing of church bells, the sound of somber Byzantine chants, the screeching of seabirds, and the clattering of wooden shutters. You would hear countless languages spoken on these streets, because Constantinople welcomed people from every corner of the known world. As a 10th-century knight named Bartolf of Nanges recorded, the population included Greeks, Bulgarians, Alans, Cumans, Pechenegs, Italians, Venetians, Romanians, Dacians, the English, Turks, and people from many heathen nations, alongside Jews, Cretans, and Arabs. He noted that people of all backgrounds gathered here. Residential houses often featured iron doors studded with thick nails. Larger homes were built around courtyards filled with stables, cattle sheds, chicken coops, and storerooms. While most staircases were wooden, the more prosperous homes used stone or even marble. Many of these wealthy residences were centrally heated using a hypocaust system inherited directly from the Romans, though most ordinary citizens simply burned charcoal in iron braziers to stay warm. Kitchens typically had low hearths with square pipes acting as chimneys to vent the smoke. During the day, the city skyline would have been hazy with smoke from these chimneys, while the smell of wood smoke and baking food drifted over the terracotta roof tiles. The flavors of the city were distinct, too. According to the 11th century cook Simeon Seth, cinnamon arrived around this time. While he believed it came from the Iraqi city of Mosul, it had likely traveled all the way from Sri Lanka. The Byzantines ate fish like gray mullet and bass, consumed sausages, and drank a spiced wine known as conditon. The air was also heavy with the earthy, salty aroma of garum, the ubiquitous fermented fish sauce. Later on, new crops like eggplant, spinach, oranges, and lemons arrived in Constantinople, adding fresh scents to the breeze wafting through the streets. Street performers, including acrobats, jugglers, and fire eaters, were a common sight. The Bishop of Cremona, visiting in the year 949, described a performance that left him astonished. He watched a man balance a wooden pole, 24 feet or longer, on his head without using his hands. Two boys then climbed up the pole, performed various tricks, and slid down head first, all while the man kept the pole as steady as if it were rooted in the ground. Of course, being poor in Constantinople was a miserable experience. Only the fortunate poor lived in houses with thatched roofs and dirt floors. Dating back to the 5th century, the city featured high-rise tenement blocks ranging from 5 to 9 stories tall. Much like in a modern city, these were divided into apartments rented out to workers at exploitative rates, and they were usually little more than slums. A visitor named Odo of Duil, passing through in 1147, summed up the city's seedy underbelly with a stinging observation. He called it a city of extremes, surpassing others in wealth but also in vice. He described Constantinople as squalid and smelly, with many areas afflicted by permanent darkness because rich buildings overshadowed the streets. He noted that these dark, dirty places were left to the poor and travelers, becoming havens for nighttime murders and robberies. In his view, people lived outside the law, with rich men acting as bullies and poor men as thieves. Yet, regardless of how people felt about the city, no one could deny it was a vibrant, energetic place. A later writer, Nyctas Choniates, described the smells of sizzling food that filled the streets daily as different cultures mixed their culinary traditions and drank strong wine all day long. Some enjoyed luxury foods, while others recreated dishes from their homelands, such as ox rib or slices of salt pork with beans and garlic sauces or other bitter flavors. It wasn't just food smells filling the air. Constantinople was famous for its perfumeries and spice markets. Extracts from the City Guild's Book of Regulations show that merchants sold pepper, spikenard, cinnamon, aloe wood, ambergris, musk, frankincense, myrrh, balsam, indigo dye, herbs, lapis lazuli, and storax. Their stalls were positioned in a row between the milestone and the revered icon of Christ above the bronze arcade. This ensured the aromas would waft upward to the icon and simultaneously fill the vestibule of the royal palace. Imports like sugar, ginger, and sandalwood arrived from India, while nutmeg and cloves came from as far away as Indonesia. On days when religious ceremonies or imperial processions took place, the unpleasant everyday odors of the medieval city were masked with wreaths of rosemary and pine chips, as well as rose petals and bundles of marjoram hung in the streets. But above all else, visitors were consistently struck with awe by the sheer size and magnificence of the place. With 500,000 residents, it was the largest city most of them would ever see. Witnessing its massive walls, paved boulevards, tall spiraling columns, vast palace complex, and the golden dome of the Hagia Sophia glinting in the sun often left travelers speechless. In the mid-10th century, the poet Constantine of Rhodes described the profound impact this city had on travelers arriving after a long and exhausting journey. From a distance, the visitor would spot towers soaring into the air like mighty giants. They would see columns stretching toward the highest peaks, alongside tall buildings and temples with massive roofs that seemed to touch the heavens. Who wouldn't be instantly filled with joy at such a sight? And upon reaching the walls and approaching the gates, who wouldn't bow their head to greet the city, kneel down, and touch the famous ground? However, over the preceding centuries, the world surrounding Constantinople had shifted dramatically. In Western Europe, the era following Rome's fall had transitioned into the Middle Ages. The once unified Latin-speaking Western Empire had shattered into a patchwork of separate kingdoms speaking many different languages, yet they were all bound together by a church that still conducted its services in Latin. To the sophisticated citizens of Byzantium, these Westerners, sometimes called Latins but more frequently referred to as Franks, appeared incredibly crude. The ancient capital of Rome had ascended once more, though not as an imperial power, but rather as the home of the Pope and the center of Roman Catholicism. Naturally, translation discrepancies between Greek and Latin religious texts sparked conflicts between the two branches of Christianity, with some arguments becoming incredibly hostile. In the year 1054, an event known as the East-West Schism ripped the Christian world in half. Every Latin church in Constantinople was shuttered, while excommunications were launched back and forth across Europe like volleys of arrows. As time passed, this divide between the Greeks and Latins would only expand. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, a feudal system established that high-ranking lords and ladies were born with the right to rule. In the West, it was impossible for peasants to rise above the humble station of their birth, but in Byzantium, there was no official legal status for nobility. Certainly, wealthy and powerful families existed and used every means possible to maintain and increase their influence, yet these great dynasties could collapse, and new figures could emerge from obscurity. Basil I, a 9th-century king who founded a major dynasty, serves as an incredible example. He began as a peasant fleeing rural poverty, traveling to the city and climbing through Byzantine society to eventually become emperor. Throughout its history, the empire even saw 4 women reign as emperor. The absence of a feudal system also allowed the empire to function as a surprisingly modern bureaucracy for that era. Western kings governed over unruly landowners and feudal barons, all of whom required constant appeasement to maintain peace and prevent civil war. These lords levied taxes on their own peasants and raised private armies, only uniting under the king's banner during times of war. In contrast, the Byzantine Empire gathered taxes directly from its provinces, echoing the ancient Romans, and operated a centralized administration that paid salaries to magistrates, officials, and a powerful, unified military. Yet despite this organization, Byzantine emperors occupied the peak of a highly unstable pyramid. Often elected to their positions, they ruled while facing constant threats from those closest to them, from courtiers plotting palace coups to military leaders who might become too strong and attempt to overthrow them. To succeed, emperors had to perform a delicate balancing act, maintaining peace among the empire's competing interests, which created a persistent paradox. Rulers required capable individuals to handle vital government roles, but the most capable people were usually the most ambitious, making them the greatest potential danger. To manage these challenges, Byzantine emperors employed several distinct strategies. First, they generally avoided ruling through their relatives. Upon a new emperor's coronation, any brothers or uncles who might challenge the throne were swiftly sent to the provinces. They were typically assigned minor roles where they couldn't cause much trouble. It was also imperial policy that no general was allowed to command troops in his home region, a rule designed to prevent any commander from amassing enough local support to challenge the empire's authority. As noted in the previous episode, the Han dynasty of China could have benefited greatly from adopting such a policy. As an additional safeguard, many emperors granted positions of power to men who were ineligible for the throne, such as bishops or eunuchs, and in later years, these figures were even entrusted with commanding the empire's armies. However, an emperor's ultimate insurance policy was to secure a strong base of support among the political elite and the general public. A coup was far less likely to succeed if the people backed their ruler, so emperors dedicated significant time to bolstering their popularity, particularly within the great city of Constantinople. Despite the Western reputation for despotism, tyrannical emperors rarely lasted long in Byzantium. In the centuries following the rise of Islam, the empire became a master of projecting what we now call soft power. Having learned the high cost of war, they preferred to avoid fighting whenever possible. The kings of Byzantium were content to let the majesty of their capital city speak for itself. They permitted foreign kings and princes to vie for the hands of Byzantine princesses and bestowed imperial titles upon them as honors. The Byzantines also hosted young foreign princes, educating them in the capital and raising them alongside the empire's sophisticated aristocracy. Furthermore, they were experts at staging grand ceremonies designed to impress and overwhelm foreign ambassadors. In the year 946, for instance, a delegation from Silesia was welcomed into the reception hall of the imperial palace. The space was adorned with silk drapes, laurel wreaths, and fresh flowers. Silver chains hung from the ceiling, while Persian carpets covered the floors and rose water was sprinkled throughout the vast room. The entire court waited there, dressed in ceremonial outfits of gold, red, and purple, as thousands of people chanted along with organ music. Meanwhile, the emperor sat upon a throne designed to mimic the biblical throne of Solomon. He was surrounded by mechanical automata, animals powered by clockwork and water. Silver lions roared and metal birds sang through complex mechanisms in their throats. While ambassadors knelt before him, this throne could even be lifted mechanically into the air. All of this theatrics served a specific purpose: to terrify and impress anyone visiting the empire. It projected a single message: you have entered the eye of Europe, the new Rome, the center of the world. And it worked. After a single visit, the ambassadors of Prince Vladimir of Kiev went back to their ruler with a breathless report. They claimed that during their time in the city, they couldn't tell if they were in heaven or on earth. They reported that no such beauty existed anywhere else, concluding that God surely dwelt there among men, making the rituals of other nations seem plain. However, soft power wasn't always enough, and when influence failed, the empire turned to the Byzantine army. In the mid-10th century, this was a massive force consisting of roughly 140,000 soldiers. That number represented about 5% of all adult males and 1% of the empire's total population. The military was split into local defense groups called themata and the professional standing army, the tagmata, which was largely stationed in the capital. This structure allowed for tactical flexibility, but it also served as a check on power. Generals were often given joint command over a province to ensure no single leader could gather enough strength to turn his men against the empire or make a bid for the throne, a safeguard learned from the civil wars that plagued the Western Empire. The Byzantines also hired foreign mercenaries, typically small units of specialized troops from neighboring regions. Yet, their greatest military asset was undoubtedly the impregnable capital itself, Constantinople. Over the centuries, they fortified the city's defenses against sieges. They constructed hundreds of massive underground cisterns to store water, ensuring they would never run dry even during the longest blockades. The largest of these, the Basilica cistern, features 366 columns supporting its vast underground vaults. Equally impressive are three huge open-air cisterns built near the Theodosian Walls. To give you an idea of their scale, one of them currently houses a football stadium. The Byzantines also forged a gigantic iron chain, with links as thick as a man's arm, which could be winched across the Golden Horn to physically block enemy ships from entering the port. Time and again, the Byzantines would retreat behind these city defenses, and no attacker could defeat them. But during the 11th century, a new threat emerged that the empire could not handle alone. This threat would force a painful compromise and eventually lead to the ruin of the great capital. It was the rise of the Seljuk Turks. Originating near the Aral Sea, the Turks had built an empire stretching across Persia, the Middle East, and the eastern Mediterranean coast, capturing cultural hubs like Baghdad. By the year 1071, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes viewed them as a severe enough danger to march 40,000 troops into Asia to meet them. They clashed near modern Armenia at a place called Manzikert. Romanos' army included only about 10,000 professional Byzantine soldiers. The remaining 30,000 were regional mercenaries from Bulgaria, Armenia, and Georgia, alongside a large group of Turkish mercenaries and Norman knights led by a Frankish general. The march across Anatolia was grueling, and Romanos alienated his troops along the way. He brought a luxurious baggage train for himself while his soldiers suffered through hardships. Rumors spread quickly, and the mood turned mutinous. On the eve of battle, Romanos divided his forces, intending to send one half on a flanking maneuver against the Turks. Instead, these 20,000 soldiers simply disbanded, leaving him with only half his army. Some of the Turkish mercenaries, sensing impending defeat, even defected to the Sultan, who welcomed them as brothers. In the Battle of Manzikert, the Byzantines were completely crushed, and Emperor Romanos was captured. He was the first Roman emperor to be taken prisoner in battle in over 900 years. When the bloodied and tattered prisoner was brought before the Turkish Sultan, the victor initially refused to believe this man was the mighty emperor of the Romans. However, the Sultan was magnanimous in victory. Romanos was held for a week, dining at the Sultan's table while the terms of surrender were negotiated. Although casualties in the battle itself weren't enormous, the blow to morale was catastrophic. Romanos returned to the empire after being ransomed for 1.5 million gold pieces, having surrendered several cities and promised his daughter to a Turkish prince. The humiliation was too much for his subjects. He was overthrown, cruelly blinded, and later died from infections caused by his wounds. This marked the beginning of the empire's true collapse. The Byzantine system of succession, which relied on bribery, coups, and deceit, had functioned adequately during times of prosperity. Under this new stress, however, it shattered. The overthrow of Romanos triggered a 30-year period of civil war and palace intrigue that damaged the state far more than the Battle of Manzikert ever could. Romanos had marched with over 40,000 men, but less than a decade later, the armies fighting in the civil wars barely reached 4,000. There were virtually no Byzantine armies left to defend the east. The Turks advanced with ease, seizing more cities just as the empire's armies were destroying each other. In only a few years, the Byzantines lost their economic heartland in Asia, the very resource base needed to rebuild their forces. The disaster was so profound that historians rarely named the battle, simply calling it that dreadful day. Writing decades later, historian Anna Komnene offered a mournful assessment, stating that the fortunes of the Roman Empire had hit their lowest point, with the Turks controlling everything from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Another historian, Michael Attila, was even more grim, writing, "We were pressed on all sides by the bonds of death." For centuries, Western Europe had relied on the Byzantines to block the Muslim empires rising in Asia. But it was becoming clear that they couldn't hold out alone forever. If Byzantium was to continue guarding the gates of Europe, it needed significant military support. In fact, it required a radical solution that would reshape the balance of power. Into this situation stepped an ambitious pope named Urban II, who would launch a new era of violence intended to restore Byzantium's power, but which would ultimately threaten to tear the empire apart. Before becoming pope, Urban II had been a French noble. He envisioned a new kind of aggressive, expansionist Christianity, and soon, a Byzantine emperor would give him the chance to test it. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos feared for his empire's future. His Asian territories had fallen entirely to the Turks, and he lacked the manpower and resources to recover them. By 1095, it seemed even Constantinople itself was in danger. Consequently, Alexios sent out a series of dramatic requests for aid. As one anonymous source recalls, Alexios sent letters filled with weeping and lamentation, begging for help from the entire Christian world and promising generous rewards. He even petitioned his bitter rivals, the the bishops of the Roman Catholic Church. Alexios likely expected the kind of help he had received in the past, perhaps a few regiments of Western knights to bolster his struggling army. Instead, he got far more than he bargained for. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II convened the Council of Clermont and urged everyone present to take up arms under the sign of the cross. For centuries, European pilgrims had traveled to Jerusalem, the site where Jesus was executed by Roman forces and where Christianity was born. As mentioned, this route usually took them through Byzantium, across the Bosphorus at Constantinople, and down the Mediterranean coast. But with Jerusalem now under Turkish control, Pope Urban envisioned an armed pilgrimage that would spread fire and death. He declared they would recover the East and Jerusalem, promising that anyone who joined the war, from generals to the lowest foot soldiers, would receive forgiveness for all their sins. To the sin-obsessed people of medieval Europe, this was an incredible promise, and the response was enormous. Writing in the 12th century, the historian Anna Komnene, who was actually the daughter of Emperor Alexios, provides us with an astonishing account of this massive army's arrival. She describes a countless mixed group converging from almost all the Frankish lands, accompanied by their leaders, kings, dukes, counts, and even bishops. To illustrate their numbers, one might compare them to the stars in the sky, the grains of sand on a seashore, or the sheer volume of leaves and flowers blossoming in spring. It is estimated that this disorderly swarm consisted of over 100,000 people, representing a gigantic migration of Westerners heading east. The group was primarily composed of mobs of impoverished peasants swept up from the towns and villages of Western Europe, and as they marched across the continent, they looted and pillaged everywhere they went. They had only reached the Rhineland in Germany when their supplies ran dry, and in a fit of rage, they turned on the substantial local Jewish population, slaughtering entire villages and seizing their food and livestock. We have a perspective from that community as well. The Jewish legal scholar and poet Eliezer ben Nathan, writing around the year 1096, depicted these crusaders in grim terms. He described them as ruthless strangers, intense, fast-moving Frenchmen and Germans who wore crosses on their clothes and swarmed over the earth like a plague of locusts. When Emperor Alexios looked out and saw this massive horde camped outside the walls of Constantinople, he must have been absolutely terrified. One particularly chaotic band of crusaders, led by a man known as Peter the Hermit, even started raiding the countryside and setting fire to Byzantine villages right near the capital. The emperor was actually forced to deploy his own troops just to restore order. He must have seriously questioned whether unleashing this frightening force was worth the risk. Yet, perhaps acting against his better judgment, he decided to make this metaphorical deal with the devil. After all, these people were fellow Christians, even if they were the rough, culturally unsophisticated Latin type common in the West. If utilizing this disorderly army was what it took to safeguard his empire, he would accept it. Consequently, he permitted this enormous crusader force to cross the Bosphorus Strait, assisting them with organization and supplies as they moved into Anatolia, passed through the Cilician gates, and entered the Holy Land. Surprisingly, despite their general lack of equipment and experience, the Crusaders performed exceptionally well. Their massive army captured the city of Nicaea in 1097, followed by Antioch a year later. By June of 1099, they reached Jerusalem, storming the city a month later and massacring the defenders. For the next 200 years, there would be a continuous Crusader presence in the eastern Mediterranean. They established small city-states and Crusader kingdoms, creating an early prototype of the settler states that would define later European colonialism. For a period of about 2 centuries, the gamble that Emperor Alexios had taken actually paid off. The 5 emperors of his Komnenos dynasty oversaw a sustained recovery of the Byzantine Empire's military, economic, and political standing. While their Muslim adversaries were distracted fighting off the constant arrival of Latin armies along the Mediterranean coast, the Byzantines were able to flourish under this military cover. However, the empire was living on borrowed time. The sheer power of the Crusades proved to the Byzantines that Western Europe was no longer just a distant backwater or the scattered remains of the Western Empire. It had evolved into a world of its own, with its own tensions, conflicts, and specific interests. The bargain Alexios struck had released volatile forces that would eventually spiral out of control, bringing the entire Byzantine Empire to the edge of ruin. All of this would finally boil over during what was arguably the most shameful campaign ever conducted by a crusading army in the East, an event known to history as the Fourth Crusade. The objective of this fourth expedition was similar to those that came before, to recapture the city of Jerusalem, which was at that time held by the powerful Ayyubids. While previous crusades had always been somewhat messy affairs, functioning like a form of guided anarchy, the Fourth Crusade managed to set a completely new benchmark for chaos. Almost from the start, the expedition faced serious hurdles. The original strategy was to march to Venice and purchase passage on Venetian vessels to reach the Holy Land. However, upon arriving in Venice, the Crusaders discovered they were severely short on funds and couldn't pay for their transport. Spotting a chance to turn a profit, the Venetians proposed a compromise. They asked the Crusaders to attack Zara, a rival city in modern-day Croatia that was currently under the protection of the Christian king of Hungary, and burn it to the ground. The Crusaders debated this moral dilemma at length, but eventually concluded that the ends justified the means if it led to the recapture of Jerusalem. They marched on Zara, besieged the town, sacked it, and destroyed it. This violent assault on fellow Christians horrified the rest of Europe. Pope Innocent III was so appalled that he issued a decree excommunicating the entire Crusader army, sending them a scathing letter of condemnation. He wrote, "Behold, your gold has turned into base metal, and your silver has almost completely rusted since departing from the purity of your plan, and turning aside from the path onto the impassable road. You have withdrawn your hand from the plow, for when you should have hastened to the land flowing with milk and honey, you turned away going astray in the direction of the desert." The commanders of the crusade, perhaps shrewdly, decided to keep the news of this excommunication a secret from their soldiers. Yet, while many viewed this massive, disorderly force as a threat, others saw it as an opportunity. One such figure was Alexios IV Angelus. Alexios was the son of a deposed Byzantine emperor, living in bitter exile with his brother-in-law, the King of Germany. He had spent his youth resentful over his family's loss, likely spending hours dreaming of restoring himself to the Byzantine throne. He had been raised on stories that the people of Constantinople were anxiously awaiting his return, a fantasy he likely believed to be true. When news reached him that the failing Fourth Crusade was wintering in the ruins of Zara, deep in debt to the Venetians, Angelus saw his opening. He approached the Crusade leaders with a straightforward proposition. If they helped him take Constantinople and installed him as emperor, he would open the empire's vast vaults, pay off their debts, and bankroll the remainder of their journey to Jerusalem. The leaders eagerly accepted the offer. When Pope Innocent learned of this new diversion, he wrote again, begging them to stop attacking fellow Christians, but the momentum was unstoppable. By April 1203, the Crusaders were at sea aboard a Venetian fleet that boasted 100 ships specially built for transporting horses. However, even as they neared the city, red flags began to appear regarding the support Angelus claimed to have. One leader, Count Hugh of St. Paul, recalled their arrival. "We passed by the arm of St. George and made port on solid ground in the direction of Iconium. There we were stunned, very much astonished that none of the friends or family of the young man who was with us, nor any messenger of theirs came to him who might tell him about the situation in the city." When the fleet arrived at Constantinople on June 23, 1203, they faced a metropolis of roughly 500,000 people. A French knight and historian named Geoffrey de Villehardouin documented the awe the soldiers felt when they first laid eyes on the city of Constantine. He described how those seeing it for the first time stared intently, having never imagined such a magnificent place existed in the whole world. They marveled at the high walls, the soaring towers, and the abundance of rich palaces and tall churches, so many that it seemed impossible until seen firsthand. Villehardouin noted that upon viewing the city that reigned supreme over all others, there was indeed no man so brave and daring that his flesh did not shudder at the sight. Despite this grandeur, civil wars had hollowed out the state's military, leaving the city defended by a garrison of only 15,000 men, which included 5,000 members of the famous Varangian Guard, the Viking warriors sworn to protect the emperor. The Crusaders sailed their fleet of over 200 ships across the Bosphorus, only to find the Golden Horn blocked by the massive defensive chain. As Sir Hugh described it, "Then we made our way towards a certain heavily fortified tower known as Galata. A very great, excessively thick iron chain was fastened to it. It ran across the sea, stretching from the tower all the way to the city walls. After suffering heavy losses during several failed assaults, success finally came on the 12th of April. The Crusaders navigated their ships beneath the sea walls, which were lower than the land-facing fortifications. Anchoring there, soldiers swarmed up the masts and scrambled across catwalks to reach the ramparts. Simultaneously, other troops landed on the shore, using picks and shovels to hack through a gateway the defenders had hastily bricked up. The defenders were overwhelmed, and the Crusaders managed to shatter the chain guarding the Golden Horn. They sailed into the port and presented their exiled prince, Alexios Angelus. He had promised that the citizens would welcome him with open arms and cheers of liberation. Instead, the sound that greeted them was the jeering of half the population from the city walls. Nevertheless, the military might of the Crusaders prevailed. The sitting emperor fled the city, and the exile was crowned emperor of the Romans on August 1st. Now in power, Angelus realized he had to make good on his expensive promises. Sir Hugh, writing to the Pope to justify the conquest, tried to paint the situation in a positive light, assuring him that the new emperor was bound by oath to provide food for the entire army for a year, supply 10,000 soldiers, and join them on the voyage across the sea the following March. The reality, however, was starkly different. Angelus quickly found that he had vastly overestimated the contents of the imperial treasury. A century of civil strife had nearly emptied it, and the fleeing emperor had taken over 1,000 pounds of gold and priceless jewels with him. With a large, impatient army camped in the city waiting for payment, the new emperor became desperate. He ordered funds to be raised by any means necessary, sending soldiers bursting into churches to seize priceless works of Byzantine art. These sacred treasures were smashed and melted down simply for their raw gold. The sight of their new emperor sending troops to destroy the holiest items in the city must have sent shivers down the spines of the populace. Despite these desperate measures, the average citizen was terrified, yet Angelus had hardly made a dent in the massive debt he owed to the Latin warriors. The Crusaders were becoming increasingly agitated because they were unable to fight Muslims in the Holy Land as originally planned. In their frustration, they turned their aggression toward the city's mosques and began persecuting the small Muslim population living there. However, Constantinople proved true to its reputation as a sanctuary for outsiders. The local residents gathered in force to defend their Muslim neighbors from the foreign invaders. In a vengeful response, the Crusaders set the city on fire. The chaos quickly spiraled into riots, which evolved into a full-blown revolution. The new Emperor Angelus was swiftly deposed by a rebel leader named Doukas, and by February 1204, Angelus had been strangled to death. The Crusaders immediately demanded that Doukas, the new ruler, pay the debt promised by his predecessor. When Doukas refused, the Latins launched a brutal campaign of revenge. For 3 horrific days, the city was ravaged by bloodshed and flames. Nyctas Choniates, a historian who lived in Constantinople at the time, recorded the tragedy. He wrote that Constantine's fair city, once the pride and joy of all nations, was laid waste by fire, covered in soot, and completely stripped of its wealth. The Crusaders initiated an unconstrained spree of looting, determined to extract every ounce of value from the metropolis. Choniates mourned the events, noting that while no bloody rain fell from the heavens and the harvest did not turn red, a silent doom arrived. He described a zealous avenger falling inaudibly upon the city, making them the most unfortunate of men, as if a beast with many legs and hands had vanished without a sound. During those 3 days, countless masterpieces of Greek and Roman art were either stolen or destroyed. The famous bronze horses that once decorated the Hippodrome were shipped off to adorn the facade of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, where they still stand today. Other ancient statues were simply melted down to create bronze currency. Choniates recalled that these barbarians and haters of the beautiful did not spare the magnificent works in the Hippodrome. He observed that everything was converted into coins, effectively exchanging great artistic treasures for small, trivial things. The Crusaders systematically violated the city's holy sanctuaries, smashing or stealing everything they could touch. They did not even respect the imperial tombs inside the Church of the Holy Apostles, plundering them without hesitation. Thousands of civilians were massacred, prompting most of the Byzantine aristocracy to flee the city. Choniates described a column of noble refugees running for their lives, only to be mocked for their misfortune by Byzantine commoners. According to the historian, the peasants and riffraff jeered at the refugees, foolishly calling their sudden poverty and nakedness a form of equality. Many locals were happy to accept this outrage, thanking the Lord that they could get rich by buying up their countrymen's property for next to nothing. Of course, these locals had not yet had much to do with the beef-eating Latins. They did not yet realize that these conquerors would serve them bile instead of wine, or that they would treat the Byzantines with absolute contempt. Proclaiming a great victory for Christendom, the Crusaders selected a new emperor from their own ranks and carved up the empire's territory into several new Crusader states. The Byzantine Empire was shattered, and for the next 60 years, Constantinople remained under the rule of a Western emperor. The locals referred to this new regime as the Francocratia, or the rule of the Franks. However, the Latin occupiers quickly discovered that governing this massive, argumentative empire was an incredibly difficult task. Throughout their reign, they hemorrhaged territory until their domain was effectively reduced to just the city of Constantinople itself. Meanwhile, rival states in Nicaea and Trebizond competed, each claiming to hold the true legacy of Byzantium. The final Latin ruler of the city was a man notoriously nicknamed Baldwin the Broke. His financial struggles were so severe that he was forced to sell off the city's holy Christian relics just to keep the government operational. He shipped the alleged crown of thorns to the West in exchange for desperately needed cash, and even sent his own son to Venice to serve as collateral for a loan. Eventually, Baldwin's mismanagement became too much for the population to bear, and he was ousted by a Byzantine lord, returning the throne to its original owners. Although modern Greece and the Asian territories were brought back into the fold, the empire was a shadow of its former self. In the year 1277, a monk traveling through the countryside to the capital noted the diminished state of the once great power. He observed that while the cathedrals remained magnificent, it was heartbreaking to see that the rest of the city had fallen on hard times. Trade had been severely restricted, with the monk blaming the wicked Latin colonies for stealing commercial advantages at the expense of the Greeks. The vast markets stood mostly abandoned, and many fine stone churches were in a state of disrepair. In the decades following the sack of the city and the incompetence of the Latin emperors, the population had barely recovered. By the end of Baldwin the Broke's reign, no more than 35,000 people lived in the capital. During this era, the city must have felt incredibly eerie. The streets no longer buzzed with the sounds of a dozen different languages, and international merchant ships no longer crowded the harbor. Constantinople had become little more than a cluster of villages scattered inside the ancient walls, separated by overgrown wastelands and crumbling ruins. In 1432, The Burgundian noble Bertrandin de la Broqueur described the scene with a sneer, noting that the city was composed of villages and contained far more open space than actual buildings. Another visitor, Archbishop Brocardus of Smyrna, wrote about the city within the Theodosian Walls with barely concealed disappointment. He remarked that despite the city's massive footprint, the population was modest. Barely a third of the area was inhabited, while the rest consisted of gardens, fields, and vineyards. He described the residents as simple fishermen, craftsmen, and farmers, noting that the nobility were few in number and weak. To visualize what the city looked like during this period, we can compare it to the war-torn city of Nicosia in Cyprus, where a depopulated buffer zone has divided the north and south since 1974. In that abandoned district, nature has completely taken over. Roof beams of empty buildings have collapsed, scattering shattered terracotta tiles across the ground. Prickly pears, aloes, and olive trees burst through cracked plaster walls and broken windows. Former shops, schools, and churches are crumbling, their rooms open to the sky and transforming into shaded gardens of wild, rambling vegetation. Today, birds like larks and lapwings fly between the ruined walls, while rare flowers, including orchids and the cypress tulip, bloom among the debris. Even in the inhabited sections, medieval Constantinople would have been a ghostly place. Built to house 500,000 residents, it now held barely 10% of that number. Its grand avenues, spice markets, and perfumeries likely sat silent, cold, and empty, save for packs of dogs wandering the lonely streets. The Byzantine Empire was truly a hollow shell of what it had been. The 14th century brought further misery with crop failures and the Great Famine of 1315, but these were merely precursors to a far greater disaster. A catastrophe was approaching that would spread death to every corner of the continent, the arrival of the Black Death. The nightmare began in the Crimean city of Kaffa, which was under siege by the Mongol Empire. Suddenly, what seemed like a miracle occurred for the defenders. A devastating disease broke out among the Mongol troops, forcing them to abandon the siege. However, as a parting act of malice, the Mongol commander loaded the corpses of plague victims onto catapults and hurled them into the town. When the Mongols departed, a group of merchants sailed from Kaffa to Constantinople, unknowingly bringing the plague with them. Constantinople became the epicenter of the Black Death in Europe. From there, the disease traveled along trade routes, causing massive mortality wherever it went. Over the next century, the plague would return to the city 11 times, with each wave bringing devastating consequences. The Greek writer Nikephoros Gregoras chronicled the horrifying effects, noting that the pestilence invaded humanity from Scythia and lasted a full year. He described it destroying coastal towns and rural areas all the way to the Pillars of Hercules. The symptoms included tumorous growths on the arms and thighs, accompanied by bleeding ulcers that rapidly killed the infected. Even the emperor, a man who had survived a disastrous 6-year civil war only to retire to a monastery to write history, was touched by the tragedy, losing his youngest son to the sickness. In his writings, he described the destruction the disease brought upon his people. He recounted how the invading plague started with the Scythians and attacked almost all the sea coasts, killing most of the inhabitants. It swept through Pontus, Thrace, Macedonia, Greece, Italy, Egypt, and beyond. He noted that the evil was incurable. Neither a healthy lifestyle nor physical strength offered any protection, as the strong and the weak, the rich and the poor, all died in the same manner. By the 14th century, the Byzantine Empire looked remarkably similar to the Western Roman Empire 1,000 years prior. The plague worsened its economic woes, and destructive civil wars drained the state's manpower. The situation was so dire that in 1343, Empress Dowager Anna of Savoy pawned the empire's crown jewels to the Venetians to fund a civil war. Venice paid 30,000 ducats for the hoard, which included the imperial crown. This sum was more than twice the city's annual revenue, meaning the Byzantines had no hope of ever repaying the loan. Despite later attempts to reclaim them, the jewels remained in Venice until Napoleon captured the city centuries later, at which point they were likely melted down for their gold. In place of the ancient diadem, the rulers of Constantinople were forced to wear a shoddy replacement crown made of gilded leather and cut glass. It was a pathetic symbol of Byzantium's reduced status. Fortunately for the Byzantines, their rivals were also suffering. While the Seljuk Turks mostly avoided the plague, their empire was dismantled by the arrival of Genghis Khan's Mongol armies. Baghdad was burned in 1258, and stories say the Tigris River ran red with blood and black, with the ink of books thrown from the city's libraries. The Seljuk lands were fractured into small Mongol client states known as beyliks. However, once the Mongols withdrew, one of these states began to rise above the others to reclaim the power the Seljuks once held. This state was known as the Ottoman Empire, and its ascent would spell the end for Byzantium. The origins of Ottoman power in Anatolia are wrapped in legend, making it hard to distinguish fact from fiction. What is clear, however, is that they possessed immense diplomatic skill and the capacity to raise vast armies, particularly powerful units of archers. Within 90 years of their founding, the Ottomans had grown into a juggernaut. Once again, the Byzantine Empire lost every single one of its Asian territories to this expanding force. Then, in 1354, a massive earthquake struck the region, destroying the Byzantine fortress at Gallipoli. As the Greek citizens fled the devastation, the Ottoman Sultan seized the opportunity. He crossed the water into Europe. They occupied the region immediately, rapidly building fortifications and ignoring the desperate pleas of the Byzantine emperor to withdraw. This seizure marked the Ottoman Empire's initial foothold on European soil, and their presence in the area would only expand as the 14th and 15th centuries progressed. By the year 1400, the once mighty Roman Empire had shrunk to include nothing more than the capital of Constantinople, a handful of Aegean islands, and scattered territories in Greece. Meanwhile, the Ottomans pushed further into Europe, absorbing land and gradually forming a pincer movement around the legendary city. Realizing the danger posed by the Ottomans a bit too late, Western powers organized several crusades to stop the expansion. But for Byzantium, this assistance came with a heavy price tag. During the Council of Florence in 1438, Byzantine representatives met with delegates from the Latin Church, hoping to reunite the two halves of the Christian world. Yet the result was less of a compromise and more of a total capitulation. Under pressure from the Latins, the Greek Orthodox priests conceded on several major theological points, effectively submitting to the Pope's authority. The reaction back in Byzantium was furious. While many viewed this surrender as a painful but necessary temporary measure to survive the looming Ottoman threat, others felt it was nothing short of cultural suicide. One high-ranking Byzantine official, Lucas Notaras, is famously quoted as delivering a stinging condemnation. "I would rather see a Turkish turban in the midst of the city than a Latin mitre." To many citizens, it felt as though the empire had already mortgaged its princes, its holy relics, and its crown jewels, and was now selling off its very soul. To make matters worse, this spiritual sacrifice provided very little safety. The Crusade of Nicopolis, organized by the Latin Church in 1396, ended in total disaster at the hands of Ottoman forces. 5 decades later, the Crusade of Varna suffered an even more crushing defeat, where the King of Poland, Vladislav III, was killed in combat. While these military efforts briefly distracted the Ottomans, the humiliating failures discouraged Western monarchs from sending any further aid to the dying Byzantine Empire. The figure destined to finally destroy the civilization that had stood for a millennium was born in 1432. This was the Ottoman king Mehmed II, who history would remember as Mehmed the Conqueror. Sultan Mehmed was a complex and puzzling figure who ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1444 at the tender age of 11. Born to a mother who had been a slave, the young ruler swore a solemn oath by the Quran and the Prophet upon his coronation that he would maintain peace with Byzantium for his entire life. In Constantinople, church bells rang out joyously at the news of his ascent, but Mehmed was a man of many layers. On one hand, he was a multilingual scholar and a poet, yet he also possessed a chillingly ruthless side. It is rumored that upon becoming sultan while still a boy, he eliminated a potential rival by strangling his infant half-brother in his crib. Young Mehmed inherited a domain of considerable size, holding territory across much of modern-day Turkey, as well as large sections of Bulgaria and Greece. However, right in the center of his lands, there was one prize he still could not claim: the city of Constantinople. In 1453, at the age of 21, Mehmed decided to roll the dice. The city remained a formidable target, defended by roughly 10,000 troops and protected by a triple line of land walls that had stood unbreached for nearly 1,000 years. Mehmed realized that smashing those fortifications would require a weapon of a magnitude the world had never witnessed. To assist him in this monumental task, he hired the services of a brilliant but radical Hungarian engineer named Orban. Interestingly, Orban had originally pitched his skills to the Byzantines, but the impoverished empire refused to pay him, perhaps doubting his wild promises. Consequently, the engineer traveled to the Ottoman capital to approach Sultan Mehmed directly. "Give me the bronze and the gold," he told the Sultan, "and I will build you a cannon such as the world has never seen." Mehmed asked Orban if he possessed the skill to construct a cannon capable of destroying the Theodosian Walls of Constantinople. Orban's response was confident. He told the Sultan that he could cast a bronze cannon designed for the specific stone capacity required. He explained that he had analyzed the city's defenses in great detail, claiming that he could reduce not just those walls to dust, but even the legendary walls of Babylon itself. The young Sultan was captivated by this promise and granted Orban every resource he requested. 3 months later, the mechanical beast was finished, and Orban named it the Basilica. It stood as one of the largest artillery pieces ever built, measuring over 10 meters in length. The weight was so colossal that moving it to the front lines required a team of 60 oxen and 400 men. To clear a path for it, they had to flatten the terrain and construct bridges across rivers and ditches. Traveling at a sluggish pace of just 4 kilometers a day, the instrument of Constantinople's doom crept closer, inch by inch. We know the details of what happened next thanks to a remarkable surviving document, the journal of Niccolò Barbaro, a Venetian surgeon residing in the city at the time. His writings provide a strikingly clear description of the events that followed. Barbaro records the moment the full might of the Ottoman military materialized before the fortifications. On the 5th of April, roughly 1 hour after sunrise, Mehmed arrived with an army of approximately 160,000 men, setting up camp about 2.5 miles from the city perimeter. Once the Sultan was in position with his troops and giant guns, the siege commenced with a terrifying barrage. The great cannon Basilica was terribly inaccurate, but when it actually landed a hit, the destruction was catastrophic. Since iron munitions had not yet been invented, this weapon fired smooth spheres of granite or marble, each weighing 3/4 of a ton, and hurled them more than a mile toward the targets. Because of the massive amount of explosives used for each discharge, the cannon had to be cooled with olive oil between rounds. We can picture the scene: workmen sweating as they labored over the hot bronze monster, the air shimmering with heat, and the scent of sizzling oil mixing with the sharp tang of gunpowder. Every time the gaping mouth fired, a huge plume of smoke erupted, and the sound echoed off the city walls like a clap of thunder. For those trapped inside, the psychological strain caused by this weapon must have been overwhelming. To prevent the barrel from cracking under the stress, the gun could only be fired 3 times each day due to the cooling process. Yet, whenever that thunderous boom echoed, the citizens of Constantinople likely cowered, looking up anxiously to see if their ancient defenses had finally given way. Niccolò Barbaro recalls the frantic efforts to patch up the fortifications as the shelling rained down. The Venetians took charge of reinforcing the breach sections. They used barrels packed with earth and stones to fill the gaps. Behind these repairs, They dug a wide trench backed by a dam, which was covered with vine strips and layers of wet branches to create a solid barrier as strong as the original masonry. This relentless bombardment lasted for 48 days, accompanied by repeated Turkish attempts to storm the perimeter. However, despite the fearsome cannon fire and being vastly outnumbered, the walls of Constantinople stood firm. Barbaro's diary details the intense combat that occurred. He observed the Turkish forces, particularly the elite janissaries, advancing directly beneath the fortifications in search of a fight. Whenever one or two soldiers fell, fresh troops immediately surged forward to retrieve the bodies, showing absolutely no concern for how close they were to the city walls. Even as the defenders rained down gunfire and crossbow bolts, often striking the man carrying the corpse so that both collapsed in a heap, others would simply step in to drag them away. These men seemed entirely fearless, willing to sacrifice 10 of their own rather than suffer the shame of leaving a single comrade's body near the ramparts. In this moment of profound darkness, the Byzantines drew strength from their storied heritage. Emperor Constantine, XI, reportedly rallied his men on the battlements with a stirring cry, urging them to hurl their javelins and arrows so the enemy would know they were facing the descendants of Greeks and Romans. The story of the Siege of Constantinople is a historical epic that has been retold countless times, with its events passing into legend. We are all familiar with the dramatic beats of this tale: the intense naval combat, the defenders scanning the horizon for Venetian reinforcements that never arrived, and the discovery of Turkish sappers tunneling beneath the walls. We remember the incredible audacity of Sultan Mehmed's plan to haul his fleet overland on wooden rollers, bypassing the Great Chain to enter the waters of the Golden Horn. While these events play out like scenes from a Hollywood blockbuster, that narrative has been covered extensively. I want to shift our focus here to what it must have felt like for an ordinary person trapped inside the city, watching their world slowly collapse from within. Inside the walls, the atmosphere was heavy with dread. Daily prayers filled the Hagia Sophia, with the austere chanting of the monks drifting over a population that was essentially imprisoned. Outside, the roar of cannon fire would have sounded like a ceaseless thunderstorm, punctuated by the popping of smaller guns and the earth-shaking boom of the massive bombards. When the wind blew toward the city, the streets must have been choked with the acrid smell of gunpowder drifting from the Turkish encampments. Barbaro's diary highlights the severe deprivation within the city, noting a critical lack of provisions, particularly bread, wine, and other necessities to sustain life. As panic and gloom took hold, Barbaro also described a terrifying omen that appeared in the sky on May 22nd. This sign seemed to warn the worthy Emperor Constantine that his proud empire was finished. In the first hour after sunset, the moon rose appearing merely as a thin sliver, like a 3-day-old moon, even though the air was crystal clear. It remained in this shadowed form for about 4 hours before gradually filling out to a full circle by the 6th hour of the night. Both Christians and pagans viewed this strange event with terror. The emperor and his nobles were especially frightened because of an ancient Greek prophecy, which claimed that Constantinople would never fall until the moon gave a specific sign. Panic was not limited to the commoners. Barbaro describes the emperor's deepening despair and his bitter grief at being abandoned by his Western allies. Seeing no other recourse, Constantine placed the fate of his city in the hands of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, and Saint Constantine. As the great Turkish guns pounded the walls into dust, fear infected the military commanders as well. The Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani, whom the emperor had appointed to lead his forces, decided to abandon his post. He fled to his ship at the boom, running through the streets crying out that the Turks had already breached the city. While despair conquered the streets of Constantinople, the Turkish camp outside erupted in celebration, their lights clearly visible to the sentries on the walls. The Turks lit bonfires throughout their lines, with every tent lighting 2 massive fires, creating a light so intense it seemed like daytime. These fires burned until midnight, ordered by the Sultan to hearten his troops because the time for the city's destruction had finally arrived. Eventually, the moment came, and the final assault began as Turkish soldiers swarmed over the walls. Barbaro recalls the sheer fury of the ensuing battle. At sunrise, the Turks entered near San Romano, where artillery had leveled the fortifications. After being pushed back from the Barbican, they fired their cannons again and rushed in behind the smoke like a pack of hounds. Within 15 minutes, over 30,000 soldiers were inside the defenses. The noise was so deafening it sounded like an inferno, with shouts reportedly heard as far away as Anatolia. Much like the Crusaders 2.5 centuries earlier, the Ottomans rampaged through the city, unleashing tremendous bloodshed. The flags of Byzantium, bearing the crescent moon and stars, were torn down and replaced by Ottoman banners. Hopelessness engulfed the citizens as the slaughter continued throughout the day. Blood reportedly flowed through the streets like rainwater after a storm, and corpses of both Turks and Christians were cast into the sea, floating like melons in a canal. No definitive news of the emperor surfaced, leaving it unclear whether he was dead or alive. Some claimed to have seen his body among the piles of corpses, while others whispered that he had hanged himself when the Turks broke through the San Romano gate. At last, the city was taken, and Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror walked victoriously through the ruined streets. It is said that, when he stepped into the haunting ruins of the Palace of Bucolion, likely built by Theodosius 1,000 years prior, Mehmed recited 2 lines from the Persian poet Ferdowsi to capture the melancholy scene. The spider leaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watchers in the towers of Afrasiab. The Byzantine Empire had stood for 1,123 years and 18 days, but now the great liturgy in the Hagia Sophia fell silent. Although a few Byzantine lords held on to fragments of the empire until 1461, they all eventually surrendered. Mehmed moved his capital to Constantinople, adopted the title of Caesar, and began an ambitious restoration project akin to the ancient emperors. At the crumbling palace of Blasharny, he planted magnificent gardens. The historian Critavoulos describes a landscape flowing with clear streams, filled with fruit trees, and alive with the song of birds. For the traumatized survivors, the conquest was a wound that would never truly heal. They converted the painful truth of their history into legend, much like an oyster turns a grain of sand into a pearl. One story claims the priests chanting in the Hagia Sophia were not killed, but miraculously melted into the sanctuary wall, waiting to resume their service when the city returned to Christian hands. Another legend says the last emperor was rescued by an angel and turned to stone in a cave beneath the Golden Horn, waiting as the marble emperor to return in triumph. Meanwhile, as the Turkish people settled in Byzantium, a massive cultural shift took place, yet the city left an indelible mark on its conquerors. Mehmed II actually claimed the Ottoman Empire was a continuation of the Roman Empire, not its end. He gathered Italian artists and Greek scholars at his court, allowed the church to continue functioning, and collected a library of Persian, Greek, and Latin works. He even invited a Venetian painter to create his portrait. While his successors largely abandoned these efforts, it is clear that Byzantium left a deep impression on this sultan's soul. The legacy of Byzantium also imprinted itself on the religion of Islam. While Mecca and Medina remained the spiritual centers, Constantinople became the cultural heart. The crescent moon, a symbol of the city since 670 BC in honor of the goddess Artemis, was adopted by Mehmed for his banner. Over the centuries, this crescent became the official standard of the Ottoman Empire, and by the mid-20th century, a recognized symbol of Islam itself. With the fall of the city, the refuge that once welcomed the world sent its own people streaming into Europe. These refugees brought with them the ancient learning of the Greeks. While the West had known Aristotle for centuries, these fleeing Byzantines introduced the Latins to the writings of Demosthenes, Xenophon, Plato, Aeschylus, and the Iliad. Historian Edward Gibbon notes that the restoration of Greek letters in Italy was driven by these emigrants fleeing Turkish arms. Scholars from Thessalonica and Constantinople taught their native language in Florence and Rome, tutoring figures like the humanist philosopher Marsilio Ficino and the poet Poliziano. The wealthy Medici family even patronized a Byzantine lecturer to open the Platonic Academy of Florence. In this way, the fall of Byzantium laid the seeds for the European Renaissance. As one age ended, another began. The collapse also disrupted the long-established Silk Road trade routes, forcing European traders to find new paths to the markets of India and China. This necessity drove the development of sailing ships like the caravel. Just 35 years after Constantinople fell, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Africa in 1488, opening the sea route to India. 4 years after that, Christopher Columbus landed in the Bahamas, opening up the New World. Columbus was partly inspired by the Geographia, a text by the ancient Greek philosopher Claudius Ptolemy, which had been preserved in Byzantine libraries and brought to the West after the fall. Even under different rulers and a different religion, Byzantium continued to welcome the tired and huddled masses of the world. In 1492, the same year Columbus discovered Hispaniola, European anti-Semitism peaked with the expulsion of all Jews from Spain via the Alhambra decree. Sultan Bayezid II, the oldest son of Mehmed the Conqueror, sent the Ottoman navy to safely escort the Jews of Spain to settle in his lands. For another generation, Constantinople once again earned the title that had captured the European imagination: refuge for strangers, the queen of cities. Today, as the writer Gaudier observed, the memory of Byzantium has been buried, and not just beneath the streets of modern Istanbul. Enlightenment thinkers largely dismissed the empire as a fossilized, static society, an embarrassing relic of a bygone age. The Turkish author Orhan Pamuk writes in his book Istanbul about how this memory has been lost. He notes that as a child, he had little interest in Byzantium, associating it with spooky priests and ruins. He believed the Byzantines had vanished into thin air, never realizing that their descendants were the very people running the local shops. Like Gaudier, Pamuk writes movingly about the city of his childhood, a place where crumbling ruins rose out of modern streets. He found a strange, melancholy beauty in the decaying walls, broken fountains, and wooden houses shaded by vines. He suggests that to discover the city's soul, one must travel down a labyrinthine path of historical accidents. Pamuk describes how the city became a stranger to its own citizens, with its collapsing buildings and crooked windows looking beautiful only to the outsiders who view them. The lonely ruins of the Theodosian Walls still trace their battered route from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn today. They stand as a testament to the spirit of a city that once promised to shelter all the people of the world. These walls symbolize the power of a people who held the remnants of Rome together, creating a flourishing empire that preserved the art and knowledge of the past for future generations. They remind us of an empire that never truly died but lives on, ingrained in the cultures of both East and West. I want to end with the lament written by the great Byzantine historian Nyctas Choniates after the destruction of his city by the Crusader army in 1204. It remains one of the most moving pieces of writing ever composed about a lost city. As you listen, try to imagine what it felt like to be a citizen of Constantinople in those final days. Imagine walking the abandoned streets, seeing the sunlight fall on faded murals, and watching the sun set over the Golden Horn and the dying empire for the very last time. City, fortified city of the great king, tabernacle of the Most High, praise and song of his servant and beloved, refuge for strangers, queen of the queens of cities, song of songs and splendor of splendors, and the rarest vision of the rare wonders of the world. Who is it that has torn us away from you like darling children from their adoring mother? What shall become of us? Where shall we go? What consolation shall we find in our nakedness, torn from your bosom as from a mother's womb? When shall we look on you not as you now are, a plain of desolation and a valley of weeping, trampled by armies and despised and rejected, but exalted and restored, revered by those who humbled you? As we left the city behind, I threw myself just as I was on the ground and reproached the walls. If what you were built to protect is no more, for what purpose do you still stand? We went forth weeping and casting our lamentations like